Great, thank you. Good morning again, everyone. Let me call the meeting to order, and Angela, you can verify a quorum, I take it.
That is correct.
Let's start with, well, as you know, we have a half a day meeting today and a half a day tomorrow, and the agenda looks like it's got a lot of really interesting stuff in it. So I think we'll just get started here. I think first we should approve minutes, and there are three sets, September 10th, October 29th, and November 13th, which are full board meetings. So is there a motion to accept those minutes?
So
okay, is there a second? Thank you, Alan. Is there a second?
Second.
As you can tell, I'm trying to do them all at once. Clever, huh? Okay, any discussion or question at this late moment about any of the three, or am I just kind of railroading these through? Fine, I'm good at this railroad. This will work. Okay, all those in favor, aye? Aye. Any opposed? Laura, are you voting or do you want to speak? No. Okay. All right. Good. Well, we're off to a great start. There were first I want to thank us all again for this. This is really an odd way, and we're now into sort of a year of this. It seems like most of us, I think, are ready to move on to the next stage of COVID treatment. At least I certainly am. In Denver, they've closed everything. You can't go in and eat. You can eat outside, but it's 31 degrees, so it's tricky. You can't go to a bar. You can't be in a gathering of more than 6 people. So, you see a lot of people sitting around in their cars, having a meeting with their children or something, because some days they go to school and some they don't. It's getting kind of ragged, I'd say. Okay. We took public comment, but we didn't get any, did we, Angela?
That is correct.
Yeah, okay. I think that's a first for our meeting too. So let's start with the standing reports, and I think let's start with Isaiah Boyd. Do I see you, Isaiah? I see your place.
Morning.
Good morning. You get to go first, Isaiah. And incidentally, thank you for the written report in the board book. It's really helpful to get that. I understand. It looked like it was a group effort, but I know somebody had to drive it. So thank you, Isaiah.
You're welcome. Thank you for allowing me to speak here today. Good morning, everyone. Always a pleasure to see your faces, whether that be virtually or, I guess, your pictures as well. I'll just go ahead and get started since I know there's a pretty packed agenda today. For this last quarter, for the fall quarter, members of ASU have been focusing on developing partnerships and relationships with student organizations, department, and administrators across the campus. The central focus of these discussions being finding potential avenues to collaborate our priorities for the year. One of those engagements that we had for this quarter was participating in the All In to Vote challenge that occurred across all Pac-12 universities. We were fortunate enough to win that challenge, having the most students pledge to vote for the 2020 election. Going forward, we've also participated in a number of task force discussions and provided aid, or have aided in providing student voices and perspectives in the administrative discussions around COVID, housing issues, and then a variety of others that we've also encountered. In anticipation for the winter quarter budget cycle, we'll be discussing our financial priorities for the current year as well as the 21-22 fiscal year. I've selected 5 programs that we intend to pursue. There's a variety, but to not bore you with all the details, I think these are the 5 most interesting, at least for me. The first being our basic needs advisor. This is a position that we've modeled off of Oregon State University's Basic Needs Center. They currently have a position there that is dedicated to aiding students in accessing and finding resources to reduce the burdens of basic needs insecurities. Our goal with this program being to reduce the barriers that we currently face when aiding students. I understand that the university provides a number of programs specifically for food insecurity and other issues that students might face on campus. But one of the things that we've noticed now is with all the information in a virtual format, there are now barriers to students accessing that information. There's a lack of awareness and knowledge that we hope that this position will be able to reduce and not have students be overlooked in terms of that. The next program, again, kind of modeling off of Oregon State University's, is a textbook affordability program. This is designed to offer a subsidy for students who meet a need-based requirement. The program would essentially provide financial support for students who would otherwise go without a textbook for the quarter, primarily due to the hardships or the financial burden that that textbook would cause for them. I found it is rather paradoxical to imagine a university where we have students paying the cost of tuition, but being reluctant to pay for a textbook that would require, would allow them to pass or meet the standards of that course. I will preface though that this is not at the fault of our faculty or staff. I understand that some of these textbooks offer a lot of great quality, and the extra dollar will go a long way in terms of the student's education. I'm finding now in my research that it's more the result of a larger publishing structure that prioritizes a profit driver rather than the dissemination of knowledge. So we're working into finding more creative ways in resolving these issues, but for now, one of the things that we've discovered at our disposal that we can help reduce this burden for students is creating a subsidy program that they can access funds to at least aid in purchasing their textbooks. That way students aren't hesitant for, do I pay for my groceries for this month, or do I purchase the textbook for my class that'll last the quarter? Making sure that every student has at least some form of access or option to access these materials. An additional solution that I hope to pursue with you all and university administrators is expanding our OER librarian position. I've researched open access resources and found that there are a variety of ways that we can pivot our education system to use these resources to reduce the burdens that students face. Of course, leaving that up to the experts, I think the OER librarian that we currently have on staff would be a really exceptional person to utilize in trying to pursue these solutions. So I'm hoping to continue those conversations into the winter quarter and hopefully into the spring quarter so that we can find a way to reduce the burdens that students are facing. One of the things that we've currently done this year is revise our Office of Student Advocacy program, looking into more creative ways that we can provide student advocacy. We're converting this program from a staff position more to a student peer-to-peer position. This is modeled after UC Berkeley's Office of Student Advocacy. They have a peer student model that we found to be more beneficial and approachable for students. We're hopeful that we can use this in meeting the needs that students are facing. Again, trying to increase accessibility to higher education, going to students and helping them where we can. The next that we have is feminine hygiene accessibility. The main thing that the trend here is accessibility and affordability. Basic needs is something that is really crucial to me, and I think higher education has its pluses and it has its cons. There's a cost burden with it, and one of the things that I don't think we should have students facing while they're attending their higher education pursuits is basic needs insecurities. So our feminine hygiene accessibility would establish free feminine hygiene products in select restrooms within our EMU. The goal being to tackle period poverty, which in our research we've discovered is a substantial issue that low-income homeless students, transgender and non-binary students are facing across the country and internationally as well. So my hope is that through the establishment of this program, we can create a new avenue that students can have access to these materials, basic needs items that they would otherwise have to go and purchase. And again, trying to minimize the financial burdens that students face while attending higher education. And then to round it all off, we have one of the things that we're focusing on with the control of the incidental fee going into our budget cycle is looking into ways that we can further aid students. One of those being investing funds into increasing student employee wages under the incidental fees. So students that we currently stipend or have on a wage-based salary, looking into ways that we can increase their wages so that they can meet the cost of living standard that Eugene has. Off-campus housing, for example, is rather pricey, as some of you might know. For a substantial majority of our student population, off-campus housing is what they end up in. And it's quite difficult to afford this while working a single job and then also a single part-time job while also attending the school full time. So my hope is that by raising wages, we can at least attempt to reduce the burdens that students are facing. I myself live off campus, and I've had to work 2 jobs just to afford my housing. And there are times where I'll have to choose between a meal or between a utility bill. And that's not at the fault of the university, but more so the surrounding Eugene living, the cost of living. So one of the things that we're hoping to be proactive in resolving this issue is increasing the wages to at least meet a lower standard of what that cost of living is. In anticipation and coordinating for the future of winter quarter, we'll be conducting a survey. One of the things that I'm very keen on is student engagement and hearing student voices. So my hope is that through this survey, we can collect and assess and collect a variety of data from the student body to have a better assessment of what their needs are and their collective needs at that. One of the things that I've really tried to prioritize in my administration is connecting with students and ensuring that the programs that we're determining to be beneficial are actually beneficial. I can make a generalized guess that will go so far to meet the needs of students, but really connecting with them, I believe, is the best way to get a feel for how should we navigate these issues and how should we go forward. So the survey will cover a variety of subjects, looking into collecting data on the financing of tuition costs, housing issues, food insecurity, and a plethora of others that kind of attach to the programs that we intend on pursuing. The intention being to just generate a demographic data of the student body that we can use going forward and hopefully provide to other university assets. That way we all have data that is more reflective of here's what the students are participating in. The central focus of this would also be to destigmatize these social issues. That way we can start talking more candidly about them. I know that there's been a number of investigations into food insecurity. Student homelessness has been a subject of discussion as well. But I haven't been able to find any tangible research that really targets these issues. And I think once we can start looking at them more candidly through an open lens, we can find more creative ways of resolving them. Going into winter quarter programming, we'll be beginning our coordination around the long session activism for higher education funding in the winter quarter as well. This will largely be collaborated through ASU's membership through the Oregon Student Association. In addition to that, we've also partnered with a national student coalition that is looking to advance advocacy at the federal level. We'll be coordinating a federal lobby day to focus on, following the inauguration, focusing on ways to increase higher education funding. One area of that focus being the Pell Grant and finding ways that we can double it or increase the funding that we currently, provide for those programs. Again, trying to find ways that we can make higher education more accessible for our students. In terms of racial justice activism, we'll be coordinating a educational series tentatively for the mid-winter quarter. The central focus of this being to provide a week-long series, bringing in speakers from all over to talk about how to combat hate speech and white supremacy in social spaces, looking at ways we can resolve institutional and systemic racism, focusing on how to better direct social activism to more productive means. And we're hoping to partner with a variety of campus departments, the Black Cultural Center, DEI, the Office of Student Life, SGES as well. The central goal being to arrange speakers that we can bring to campus that will provide an educational space for students to really take a hold of ways that we can really combat these issues. And then lastly, just to finish off, as we go into the winter quarter in terms of the university tuition setting processes, we're hoping to expand and find more creative ways that we can engage students into these, making sure that we're still being respectful of how can we incorporate student voices so that they're heard in the processes that impact them the most. And then lastly, our UOPD discussions and making sure that we are still maintaining spaces that students can have open discussion and provide feedback to the university. That way we're coordinating as a whole community rather than unilaterally. And I believe that is all I have in my ramble. If there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to clarify or answer any of them. Otherwise, thank you all for the time and have a good Thursday afternoon or Thursday morning.
What a great and thorough report. Thank you, Isaiah. Are there questions, Ginevra?
Isaiah, thank you. I'm curious what you're finding in terms of communication these days with students, because a lot of what you've talked about, and I think always with ASUO, but especially this year, you've talked a lot about needing or what that communication is going to look like. And I'm curious what you've been able to accomplish or trying to accomplish. Everything from suasion around, these COVID behaviors and things like that with students that aren't necessarily directly engaged with student government. How do you contact or reach out to, Big Life, for example? Also, you're talking a lot about, you've got resources that people don't know about. Are there opportunities with COVID communication strategies that might not have been there before? And then also, I'm really wanting to make sure that you're involved with the TFAB. Make sure that's really a key thing for you to have that engagement. I think that it's been an incredibly evolving process over the last few years, specifically to engage students better and better and better. And so I'm really hoping you're feeling good about that and will be involved. Thanks.
I guess to go working backwards, yeah, tuition, the TFAP process, I've had the privilege to sit on that committee this year. My hope is that with a virtual format, we might be able to make those informational sessions or workshops around the processes that we're using in that committee or that board to really disseminate the information and make sure that students are included. My hope is that a virtual setting will make that more accessible, looking into the cup half full kind of mindset with COVID and everything. I'm hoping that Zoom and other web platforms will allow students to really participate and engage in these processes. One of the things that ASUO has been traditionally, or it's been using, I'd say rather exceptionally this year, is social media platforms. With a virtual world, students are connecting more deeply through social media platforms. So one of the things that we've been trying to prioritize is making sure that we're going to them and bringing all the information, providing statements and documents on what ASUO is doing, what initiatives we're taking on, and how to coordinate students around those. That way that they can at least access the materials. Whether or not that's been successful, I can't fully say. It's a trial and error system, but I definitely think we've had a better connection to the student body this year than years prior that I've witnessed.
Lisa, you had a question, I think.
Thank you. Isaiah, I think your presentations the last two meetings have been really great, and not just how well you present, but the content and what you're doing for our student body. So I want to thank you for that. And this might be something we can talk about in our discussions on Friday when it's a smaller group. But I want to kind of follow up on the food insecurity. The last numbers that we had, I think, were from a survey in 2018 of basic needs, food insecurity, the 56% of students feeling that. I suppose your new survey is going to follow up on that, so we have more current numbers. But I'm also wondering what you've seen over the fall term of increase of going to food pantries or the duck nest or SNAP. Are we seeing, because of COVID and job losses on campus and elsewhere, that's a growing number of students that are accessing those things now? And I don't know, this might be also for the people in student life, but I'm wondering how many students are staying on campus maybe over the holidays and are not going home because they are getting access to what the university can provide that they might not be getting at home. So that can be for a discussion Friday if you need more time, but something I'd be interested in following up on. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I will definitely look into that. I can provide that information Friday, most likely be able to get a hold of it better. But I'm from a generalized estimate from the discussions we've had with a number of constituencies, COVID has definitely had an impact on students in terms of just basic needs and the affordability of items that they need to survive. I've talked to a number of students who have lost jobs either through the university or externally to the university that has had an impact on where they're currently located. Some students had to return home and find other avenues to be able to afford their fall quarter in managing school and all of that because of the impact that COVID has had on their financials. So I can definitely provide, and I imagine the Office Student Life will probably have a better estimate in terms of students that are staying on campus and accessing the resources that we are providing. but we're hoping to expand those going into the winter quarter. We've gotten, one of the things that we've done to answer food insecurity going forward is coordinate with the student organizations that we currently have funding for this current year, and looking at whether or not they're utilizing the funds that we've given directly for food initiatives. If they haven't spent those funds already, one of the things that ASU is hoping to do is refund those funds back to the executive branch so that we can then donate them to the Ducks Feeding Ducks program, or find more innovative ways to provide additional food security efforts or funding for food security efforts.
Great. Any other questions for Isaiah? I have one if no one else does, but sort of two, Isaiah. One is, I was impressed that you were able to find $349,000 of reserves to bail out something that not everybody could do that, not every organization. What is the size of your budget annually?
I'm not good with the estimate. This is a rough rounded off number. I believe this year's budget was $17 million. One of the things that I did prior to my position now was I served as the ASUO Student Body Senate President. That was in charge of managing the incidental fee and coordinating the efforts around that. Before I left that office, we made sure to attempt to consolidate our funding in anticipation for the deficit this year. And luckily enough, we ended up with a surplus of, I believe, $1.1 million, or $1.3 million. Having those additional funds allowed us to manage our deficit rather easily this year. And because of that, we've had a trickle down effect where we're now able to focus more specifically on the programs that we're funding for the coming fiscal year, and focusing on ways that we can get more innovative with how we use our funds.
Well, congratulations and thank you for your careful management of your money. The other question I have, and I don't know, Isaiah, whether this is for you or for President Schill, but who on the campus is our resident expert in Pell Grants and how they work and how they're funded, and who is the person that our go-to person for that?
I can answer. That's Jim Brooks, who's head of our financial aid office.
Okay, all right, good.
Chuck, can I just make a comment?
Sure.
So I just want to emphasize what Isaiah said about textbooks, how important this is. I mean, when we hear about textbooks, I think we think about a book that's $35, $40. I'm a textbook author. I'm actually coming off the book very shortly. The book is not $35 or $40. That's what it was when I was in law school. The books are over, I mean, I don't even know what ours sells for, but I think it's $200. And so if the students each quarter are having to buy textbooks, this is adding a tremendous amount of money to their bills. And let me assure you, the incentives in the publishing companies are not about affordability and access. It's about how you can get the most money, wring the most money out of these books. And you see all sorts of stratagems to deal with the used book market, which is where I bought all my books when I was in college. They make it impossible because what they do is they change editions every 2 or 3 years. And it's not that there's that much new going on in the book. It's just to create a new market. So Isaiah, I really appreciate the efforts that you're making. I know the Senate is making efforts in this. There's a task force in the Senate to deal with this issue. And so it's really important.
Okay, anything else for Isaiah? Isaiah, thank you. Great job. Let's move next to the Senate President. Elliot, I saw you here someplace.
I'm here. Good morning.
Oh, you are. Welcome. And once again, I appreciate very much the fact that you gave us something in advance to read. So the floor is all yours, Elliot.
Thank you. Morning, trustees. Yeah, it's great to hear from President Boyd. Thank you, Isaiah. I think we're really, really fortunate to have his leadership this year, and just sad that we live in a world where so many of those initiatives are necessary. I just want to give you an update on a few things the Senate's been working on. Sort of standard things that we think about. But primarily, I want to kind of give you an update on two things. One, first is our work on equity and inclusion, which I do see as the most important thing to work on this year, both because frankly, I think we have a lot of room for growth at the university in this area. And of course, it's very timely with the protests and the social movement this spring, summer, continuing into the fall. So we've created, together with the Division of Equity and Inclusion and the Teaching Effectiveness Program, a Senate Anti-Racism Academy. The idea is for the Academy to be faculty-led, open access curriculum for essentially education for faculty and everyone else on campus to learn about these issues, to help participants recognize, examine, address their own beliefs that kind of related to these issues. The Senate is going to lead the Academy and will share the materials so that other people can kind of follow along. So, I'm asking the board to help on both of the issues I'll talk about today. So, what can you do? The first is I invite you to participate in the Academy along with us. We'll definitely get you the materials. We'll be sharing them, with everybody. That's the idea. And I encourage you to consider forming your own community of practice on the board to discuss issues related to equity and inclusion on campus. Like all of us, the idea is to use the materials and engage with them in whatever way that you can. So I hope you view this as an opportunity to show board leadership on this issue. And the second thing you can do, which I know you're already kind of thinking about, is to help us continue to build the data dashboard so we can gain some visibility into where and how these issues are playing out around campus. It's become quite clear as we started to move forward that, to act effectively, you need to have good information about what's happening on the ground. And we've been frustrated at many points about understanding exactly where these equity issues are, in what ways they're manifesting. We have some information, we know they're happening because we hear them from people, but there's really a lack of systematic information, and that's a problem for, obviously, it impedes efforts to address the problem. I'm sure you can appreciate that. So we're grateful for your continued support in that effort. And then the second topic I'd like to discuss is our presence, the university's presence at the state level. You might know that I testified at the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, where they've updated the student success and completion model. I'm sure you're aware of this, you'll hear more about it. That was a pretty interesting process to me as a somewhat newcomer to the state politics. I've been following this as an interested faculty member for the last 10 years, but never really engaging at the level of, sort of presenting at a HEC meeting. And what was notable to me is the way the state focuses almost exclusively, maybe entirely exclusively, on undergraduate student success, which, that's a great thing. We all want undergraduate student success, but what really struck me is that there's really no attention to the rest of the mission or the purpose of higher education. They view it as like diploma mill, right? It's like, we expect you to produce diplomas for the state, which is such a myopic view, and just misses so much of what higher education contributes. And so I tried in my presentation to underscore, what one other element of higher education, the research, which is what part of our mission, obviously, contributes. Obviously, there's an educational component to that, right? Students get involved in research, students learn, doctoral students and master's students get degrees and learn. But of course, we produce knowledge, we generate jobs, we generate innovation, all of the great things we heard about in the night campus launch yesterday. It's just completely not part of the conversation at the HEC. So I think, we all need to make a concerted effort to really hammer this point home to legislators and policymakers and everyone else that we know that has any kind of leverage in the state as often and as loudly as possible. I don't feel like we had a great, or the other universities for that matter. I think there was one board member from, was it Eastern Oregon maybe presented at that meeting? But I feel like board members attending these meetings, talking to legislators saying, hey, you know what, we're going to do research because it's good, it's part of our mission. And you also need to know how it benefits the state. That's just, it's lost. I think that's, you know, I hope you can hear my desperation. We desperately need them to understand that. Otherwise, we're not going to be a research university for very long. You know, sorry, on that grim note, I'll close by acknowledging, because I mean, basically just to say, like, we can't do it on our own, right? In fact, we can bring in grants and stuff, but that won't, you know, we don't want to become a soft money research institution. I mean, maybe that's what we want Knight to be, but we want the university to be a state research university, and that, you know, they need to understand why that's important. So I'll close by acknowledging the progress we've made in this relationship with academic administrative leadership. I mentioned this last time, and I think it continues to be true. You know, we can't make progress on any of these issues. I mean, especially equity, of course, on our leadership of the academic mission of the university without partnership, particularly with the Office of the Provost. And I feel like we have a great relationship there. You know, we collaborate effectively, and that'll enable us to really make good changes, positive changes. Okay, so that's it for my remarks today. I wanted to leave a little time for some question, you know, Q&A or conversation if you have some time for that.
Great job, Elliot. And I guarantee you opening the door for a conversation about our relationship with HEC is, yeah, that's ground zero. So terrific. Okay, Marcia, you had a question, I think.
Yes,
Thank you.
Yeah, I got two computers running at the same time. I had to figure out which one. Elliot, you talked about a need for data. I'm sure Angela is smiling in the background because she knows how I feel about that. I'm curious what data you are in need of, and what data do you have? I know that's a broad question, but.
It is. Thank you for that question. And that's something, you know, others who are more familiar with this can probably address this. And we have proposals that there are drafts. I'm not sure if they're ready to be shared out yet, but they're drafts of exactly, you know, answering exactly that question. What are we looking for? I mean, essentially, it's a couple of different classes. Some of it is student information, right? We want to know the diversity about our students and then also their experiences. So for example, I want to know, I'm in psychology, how many reports of, you know, discrimination or, you know, reports of students feeling uncomfortable in a classroom in my department have there been? I don't know. I don't know who to ask. Nobody seems to know the answer to that question. That's not exactly true. That's not fair. There's people who know, but there's, you know, there's complexities in answering that question, but still at the end of the day, it's like, you know, how are we doing in psychology? Are we doing worse than linguistics or sociology, or, you know, and when we're doing badly, what is going wrong? Is it something that other students are saying in the classroom? Is it something that faculty are saying? You know, these are the questions we need to have answers to be able to address this classroom climate problem that is a major retention issue, right? That's underlying a lot of this stuff, in addition to being the sort of moral issue of the day. And then the other side of it is, of course, the climate for, you know, faculty and staff, and, you know, sort of equity issues on the kind of employment side. Which again, you know, there are different avenues for reporting. I'm not sure that I would really have a good sense. For example, you know, do the folks who work in the EMU feel like they're, you know, there's acts of discrimination and so forth? How do we know that? So I could go on, but those are just a couple of examples that are in that spreadsheet.
Other questions for Elliot? Yes, Connie, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Berkman. This is really less of a question and more of a comment. You may know I also work at a university, and I just want to say I truly appreciate the leadership coming out of the Faculty Senate. It's really exciting to see you're coming forward, the board of directors, and talking about how you want to make the university better and how you want to serve the students. So just want to say thank you for that.
Thank you. Other questions?
Thank you.
Elliot,
Laura Lee.
can I ask you and others about the situation with HEC? Maybe one question I have is maybe best directed at Jamie, if you're on there. I think you're on, Jamie. Over the last several years, we've had a number of conversations with HEC about their allocation model between the across the various universities. And no matter how we calculate it, the University of Oregon in Eugene is always at the bottom of the list in terms of any kind of standard metric per student hour, per anything. And we've been told over the last couple of years repeatedly that allocation model is being redone in a way that the University of Oregon would be less handicapped, if you will. What is the status of that now? And I don't know who to ask that of, but
Jamie would be a good person.
yeah,
And I should just acknowledge before you start, Jamie, that you've done great work here. And the latest version of the allocation model is more generous to the University of Oregon. I mean, I think our position is it's great. We like it. It doesn't go nearly far enough. Jamie can say.
yeah, that's accurate. So Chuck, I was part of an interinstitutional task force that met for about 14 months. It was about 20 people working with the HEC to try to update the model. And as you might imagine, the HEC started that process asking us to try to come to consensus on changes. Well, as you might imagine, when you have a fixed pie of resources and you've got people from every institution and you're trying to change the rules on how you divvy up those resources, it's very hard to come to consensus, particularly if you think that pie is shrinking, which many of us think. What ended up happening was over the course of that time period, the task force did come up with some very reasonable technical changes to the model. So these are things like updating the cost weights and making sure that certain bonuses are additive and consistent, those types of things. But at the end of the day, there was not consensus around the entire package of changes. And so the HEC staff had to come forward on their own with some recommendations, which they did to the HEC last month. I will tell you, not surprisingly, the campuses that do better under the new allocation, and U of O is one of those campuses that would do better. Now, not as much better as we'd like, but it is movement in a positive direction. Those campuses all supported moving in this direction. And the campuses that, would lose funding all voiced lots of different concerns about making changes to the model at this point in time, given the pandemic, given the likely cut in state funding, all of those things. So where we stand today is that the HEC did approve moving forward with the model changes in their meeting last month. However, there are a number of very important technical details that vastly impact how the funding might be distributed, and those are still to be worked out. And there's an entire rule-making process that will happen between now and February. And so I think a lot of the devil is in the details of what might happen in the coming months. But there has been some progress in this area. And while I can say it's not as much progress as we would have loved to have seen, it's still progress. And hopefully will start us down the road that puts us into a position we feel is better from a funding standpoint.
Chuck, could I just make a couple comments that Jamie didn't make? Well, first is we had Jamie on, also Bill Harbaugh was on as the representative of the interinstitutional senates. So it's all of the senates in the state. And we are coming out better, at least before, people start monkeying around with the technical changes. But it's not that much better, right? So we're still second to last. PSU continues to be last. And I believe, Jamie, how much more under the most optimistic scenario would we get per year? And what percentage of our allocation would that be, just roughly?
Yeah, so today we're getting about $80 million a year. And the last set of numbers I saw put the changes potentially, and I only say potentially because they're all estimates and they depend on how many students each campus educates and all that stuff, but potentially in the range of our allocation going up by a couple $1 million just because of the model changes. So maybe positive a couple $1 million off an $80 million base. So it's not gigantic swings. And I will tell you, as we negotiated, and I did view it as a negotiation, the model changes there are somewhat competing philosophies, I think, in that group. There were some campuses, and we were one of them, that felt like you really should focus on what is the right allocation model, forget the past and what we've done in the past. Let's just try to get it right today. And there's others that, in addition to that, we're also looking at, well, how much change are you asking certain campuses to absorb in terms of, cuts to their budget on top of the state budget cuts that we were likely to see. And so I do think both of those parameters ended up playing into the final recommendations that the HEC staff made. But to Mike's point, we're not talking about 20% changes in funding. We're talking about maybe 3% or 4% or 2%, something in that range. It's not going to be significant shifts, especially in a time period where the PUSF is likely to shrink.
Yeah, and I'll just say one more thing and then I'll stop on this. I was one of the advocates for having them redo this. When I became president, it just was crazy that the University of Oregon was getting so much less per student, and we are a research university with much higher costs. And then this process happened, and I'm pleased that we're going to do better. But overall, for me, it's a disappointment. Then that's not to say that Jamie's not working hard and Bill's not working hard, but we just ended up not where, this is a political process.
Laura Lee, you had a question, I think, did you not?
Yeah, I did. It's probably more complex than we can get into here, but I really want to thank Elliot for testifying at the HEC and for bringing the values of a research institution kind of front and center for anyone that's been involved in this process. And so many people have. It's frustrating. And you kind of identified some of the barriers, that there are these legacy values that really value perhaps, primarily or exclusively undergraduate. I think you use like diploma mills, and for institutions that do things a little bit different, have a research focus, include doctoral education and so on, there's this perhaps inherent bias or downplaying. And I'm just wondering if you have any insight based on your engagement with the HEC, or any insight in how we can better position ourselves, because it's apparent that change is very, very slow, and the change that does occur is minuscule. It's important, but there is a long path ahead. So any reflection on sort of the barriers or the challenges and whether they're indeed surmountable would be helpful.
Yeah, that's a good. We need to think strategically. Frankly, my sense, and again, I'm not, admittedly a newcomer to this, and so take that for what it's worth, right? And it just, all this struck me because I was a newcomer coming from California, a state with a very different kind of landscape with respect to these things. One is the sort of aspiration seems so humble. Maybe that's an Oregon value. It's like they don't want us to be like, we want to have a public university that competes with privates that are, it's like University of Virginia is the model that I have in my mind, like this outstanding research university that's a worldwide beacon. It's like, no, let's we want our high schoolers to get degrees, and that's a mindset that's kind of somehow very, very Oregon. I kind of get it. I don't want to disparage it, but I think I don't have a lot of hope that mindset will change, that all of a sudden Oregonians will want like an Ivy League, in their backyard. So that, and I sent the statement that I gave to the HEC to Angela, and she'll share with you. So the tack that I took was to underscore what research does for Oregonians. And it's easy to make that argument. It's like, do you want social workers? Do you want doctors? Do you want, medical professionals, nurses? These are the people who are doing research in our labs, in my lab and Laura Lee's lab. They go on to graduate school in social services and medicine. Like that is the value to the undergrads, is they get this really great, unique research experience. And then they go on to these really valuable jobs for the state. And a lot of them do stay in Oregon. So, that's my sort of best pitch to them about why they should care. And that's, it's not something they can get at a community college or a local school. You need to have a research university to be able to provide those opportunities. And not to mention, of course, the direct benefits of the research itself, which again is, feels like kind of shouting into the void.
We've had this as a topic for board discussion ever since we've had the board. And a number of trustees have spent time with HEC trying to work through this issue and et cetera. And we've had, I think, if you polled anyone in Salem and you ask where do they get the best help from universities, you would hear about Jamie and Hans, and you'd hear about our crew. So I think, Angela, we need to at a board meeting soon look at the 2021 plan and have a discussion in a comprehensive way about what the 2 or 3 key objectives are and what do we have to do to take another pass at this, because I think it's really almost criminal the way we get treated by HEC. So let's try to get that. We don't have time right now. Elliot, thank you for raising, obviously, this is ground zero, but Angela, if we can get something on the next, or on us, maybe if not the next board meeting soon.
Yep, we're actually talking to Hans about possibly doing an off-cycle meeting in the end of January or February before the session starts.
I think it's really worth our energy. I know, Mike, it's frustrating as heck to all of us, but I think we ought to try to kind of do another comprehensive look. And
thank you.
Jamie, keep swinging in there.
Could I just add, on behalf of the faculty, I mean, the faculty are eager to talk to the extent that you and Hans feel it would be helpful. We could talk for days to legislators, to whomever, about our research and how valuable it is to the state and to the education of our students and all that. So, if you want people to come and talk to legislators or whatever, the faculty are here. We want to do that.
And we've had past experience with the faculty, and it has generally been very impactful. I think for all of us, for the trustees, the faculty, staff, we just have to make sure we all have the same 5 bullet points that we're going to stand on, that, we want to send people in there to plead, knowing what we're negotiating for, not having that as an open issue. Yes, Ginevra, one more comment, then I think we need to keep moving.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Thank you. As you noted, we have been talking about this from multiple perspectives from day one, and we're not done by any means. I worry about the dichotomies. Elliot, I think there's tension that I've heard over the years just from Senate about research versus liberal arts. Again, that doesn't need to be a dichotomous thing. I think we need to embrace it all. And same with some of the metrics. There's clearly national, state, family, familial pressure around getting the undergraduate. I think calling it a mill is unfortunate, but graduation rates at 4 to 5 years. We've also talked forever about the non-traditional student and what that's going to be. I think we need to establish metrics, and I think some of it's PR and some of it's accreditation and some of it's, it's all these different pressures, but I think we should have a much more complex reaction as to what we are, who we're serving. It's not one type of student and not one type of faculty and not one type of research. I think that's what's exciting, but it's also challenging. Thanks.
Okay, we'll keep that. Thanks for handing us the ball again. Okay, Patrick, we're ready to move to the provost report, and congratulations again on all you did to make the Knight campus have the launch it had. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Chuck. And it's my pleasure. It's a very exciting day. I was very excited the entire day, and I think did a great job. I'm a little sad that we haven't had a chance to tell the full story of the building itself, which is actually quite extraordinary. And I look forward to being able to bring everybody through so you can see all the little nuances and how exciting it is. I think it's, I just put this in an email to Chuck. I actually think it'll be a national landmark in research buildings. I hope that we've achieved something. And I was quite nervous about it, but Bob Goldberg keeps telling me that, yeah, no, it's really good. So there was a lot of faith put into the actual work. I also want to complain that President Schill again violated our pact that we're supposed to check in with each other on our clothing. Somehow we end up wearing the same outfit every single time. I don't know how that happens, but we'll live with it. Thank you so much for providing time. And, I'm actually doing my Christmas cards now. And thank you for all the work that you have given the university and continue to give. I'll just do a very brief update on a couple of things. Mary and I have been talking about our plans for how we can start bringing the initiative work that we're doing on campus to the board. I think you've heard me say that I'm really focused on what recovery looks like and the resilience of the institution and how we're going to keep building on the themes that Elliot was just discussing in terms of being an excellent research university that services our students and as well as provide platforms for our faculty to do amazing things with the help and assistance of all the staff on campus. And I think that we still have great stories to tell. In fact, I've never had greater clarity. So it's either a sign of mental illness or that the fact that we're doing the right thing, that it's very clear what we're doing is the right things to be doing. So I think we'll be talking more in March, and then we'll start rolling out some of these initiative things. I do want to let you know that I think everybody knows that the very first initiative announced was in the environment. It's a very Oregon thing, and it's something that we've actually, if you look at the faculty we have, we're already investing tens of millions of dollars in this space. And so it's a great place to amplify what we do. We've just hosted a series. Adele Amos is the director of that initiative. Adele just hosted a series of workshops. We had about 60 people participate in those workshops. We have a survey that's open until December 16th for all faculty, staff, and students who want to participate. We've had more than 200 people fill out the survey. And so we'll roll into the winter. Adele will start working on collecting those things. We'll start developing priority areas. And then the president, as I will say in public, has committed resources to help get this really rolling aggressively. And so we're doing that in diversity. We're doing that in several other areas in a very organized, deliberate way that's inclusive of faculty and staff voices on campus. And so I think it's going well, and I'm looking forward to the next steps there. Another positive note is that we've hired a new dean for the College of Design. I'm very grateful for Laura Vandenberg. She has provided just a steady hand at the wheel. She's a great person, as well as a great member of the faculty of the College of Design in her interim role. We have hired Adrienne Parr, and hopefully you've seen the news story about her. I think Adrienne will be a great leader for the College of Design and a great partner for the success that we're looking for across the board at the university. So in general, we're just about to complete hiring of a new director for this innovation initiative. That is one of the initiatives that we're moving forward. And I've been very impressed with the quality of the candidates that we've had in each of these spaces. And I think it's a great indicator of what we're doing well. I'm currently interviewing candidates for the head of the libraries as well. And each of them, matter of fact, I just went through 11 interviews, and almost all of them comment on the rising stature of the University of Oregon. Almost all of them have noted the night campus investments and all of these other things. So I think it's paying off in the ways that we would hope it would, and that is to raise our stature, not only with students, of course, and not only with the work that we do, but to make us more visible for external candidates who are excellent that we want to bring here, and then keep that cycle rolling. While I'm talking about the library, I really appreciated so many things that Isaiah talked about. I think it's very thoughtful leadership, and I think these are issues that are critically important, obviously to our students, but we want to figure out ways of helping in this space. Almost all the library candidates spoke to this OER issue. On the research side, the Provost's office and the libraries together with the Senate have partnered on an open access examination of the policies that we have. It's clear that the future of higher education is to make information more freely available. We're already paying a lot of money to generate that. We just have to break through on what that cycle is going to be. The University of Oregon can only do so much on its own. But I think as universities as a whole, especially public universities, wade more heavily into this space, we'll be able to deliver better value for our students and also make all the research for our faculty more legible immediately to the external world. And that's really a core value that we have within the institution. So that is a place where libraries can really lead us forward, as Isaiah already noted. I will also note that many of the issues that he talked about there's a strong state interest as well, including things like food insecurity. And I'm very sad that, as Elliot noted, that that these are issues that we have to be addressing. And I could say a lot more about that, about the economic model of education in a public institution. I don't think that all of us are really appreciating the cost to students as we think about many of these other balancing factors. We're treated as though we're a public good, a public service organization, including by the state, but in fact, the students pay the bulk of the fees. They're not taxpayers per se. I have so many things I could say about the final discussion that we had with Elliot about the HEC. I have to say that I think we've been playing checkers a little bit in this space. In the HEC's defense, by charter, they have a charge, which is to basically steward the resources that the state invests for Oregon students. And it's not a surprise then that their scope is small relative to what their charge is. I've met with almost all the members of the HEC Commission. I think they're actually great people. They take their job seriously, and their vision for helping the students of the state is actually quite expansive. I think they do their job as it's assigned, and it's assigned to them in the HEC Commission. I think it's the wrong place to start blaming them for not having a vision for higher education. I think the blame is on us. We have not delivered that vision to the state as a group. I think we have to take that charge. We cannot rely on the HEC to do that because their charge is too narrow. And when we push back on this is day one as provost, I've been bringing this argument forward. They say that's not our job. And until it is either made their job or there's some other way of engaging this. So I think this is organic and it's fundamental to the state. I think it goes back to the OUS, and it's a reframing, not of the entire process, the way that we approach it. It's not taking the existing structures and then bemoaning the fact that they don't do what we want. That is, of course, we're in this financial reality that the HEC does allocate the funds. Again, these are allocations of state funds for Oregon students for the most part. So the HEC will not acknowledge that out-of-state students matter to universities. And in fact, that we are bringing intellectual capital to the state and capitalizing on investments that other states have made in training students through the primary things, and then bringing them to Oregon to help Oregon itself. They do not acknowledge or recognize the role of higher education in the state economy. All of these are fundamental issues, and I've been speaking to them with the HEC. I think you should know that the provosts are the ones who interact the most. Of course, Jamie's financial interactions are the most critical for the institution, but on the academic side, it's the provosts who are in these conversations. Transfers and other issues are of utmost importance to the state and the legislature as well. And this is something that we have not historically, quite frankly, done as good a job as we should. And I'm trying to move us towards doing that more aggressively. So there's a lot to be done here. It's a question of time and our own investment and whether or not the University of Oregon is going to continue to carry all the water for these issues in the state. And we're developing a very strong partnership, especially with OSU on this. And so I'm looking forward to that work. Getting back to the slightly more mundane, we are going to move forward with start hiring faculty. So we've instituted our institutional hiring plan process, and again, encouraging departments to think about how they see their futures. It'll probably be next year that we'll think about integrating some of the hiring more directly with the initiatives that we're doing. we're still waiting to hear from the faculty how they think we should be focusing those efforts. So I don't want to be premature in doing that. I also want to acknowledge that Danica Scott, who's been a regular participant and board members, is going to be leaving the University of Oregon. We're very sad about that, but we're very happy for Danica. She's essentially moving into this very elevated vice presidential role at North Carolina State. Her portfolio include housing, student success. She's even the dean of a small college, and so lots of things. So it's a great move for Danica, but because Danica's, and she's obviously been a very vocal and effective leader for student success. But Danica's departure does not take our eye off the ball there. We obviously are doubling down even more in that, and we're very fortunate that Kimberly Johnson, who's is the head of our advising group and is also a very articulate and effective member for advocating for student success, is stepping in as interim. And I look forward to working with Kimberly, and I think you will enjoy hearing from her more frequently as well. And then I know Andre is coming next. I just want to remind everybody that we are continuing our work through this COVID crisis. I think we are not in crisis as an institution. We have been very calm and deliberative in our approach. We decided a long time ago to go fully remote after Thanksgiving. It's not an accident that that seems to be coordinating with what is essentially a national crisis, and we're heading for a very dark winter, which saddens all of us in this country. But the institution as a whole, from a planning perspective, has been very well situated to make sure that this does not derail our work. And so these are decisions that were made long ago, and we will continue to do that as we head into the winter and beyond to do the best that we can, the most that we can in this public health setting. We're very optimistic about the vaccine, and we'll have plans around that, but obviously no one knows exactly what that's going to look like. And we are ramping up on our testing, and that will provide new capabilities. So we're very hopeful looking ahead, especially the president and I are talking a lot about looking ahead to what the fall will be, but we don't know the answers to that yet. But I think that those will become clear over the next couple of months. And so we'll keep you in that loop as we move forward. So with that, I will end. And I don't know, we might not have time for questions, but I'll leave that to Chuck and Angela.
Can you take one or two, Patrick, if people have questions? I think Alan, you go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, Patrick, I'm probably being maybe this is not appropriate subject to bring up at this meeting, maybe down the road. My question is, these tough economic times, and we're all going to be pressured both in terms of revenue and looking at the expense side. I think it's been a long time since we've had a discussion of what actually is the budgeting process. And what I'm speaking in, there was concepts of what I would call clusters, establishing priority. And of course, in our previous provost, there was a real effort to change the allocation of resources working with the various deans. We don't have time today to get in all that detail, but I guess I'm just raising that question, whether it's something down the road maybe we could review.
Always happy to go over that. I think, one of the challenges of this institution is that we've had 3 or 4 budget models in the last decade, as we've been responsive mostly to ongoing state cuts to make sure that individual units, departments, and colleges don't get whiplash. And the other pressure has been on benefits, of course, especially with the PERS rates and the major expense, 80 or more % of everybody's budget is personnel. So we've shifted the way that goes. But we just actually went through our quarterly budget reviews with all of the schools and colleges. And suffice it to say, I'm being very bottom line oriented. We have a lot of central pressures, and I'm sure you'll hear that from Jamie, because tuition comes centrally. Expenses are spent in the units, but we have a lot of savings due to COVID because people aren't traveling, they're not using copy paper, all these kind of little things. So a lot of our discussions on the budgetary front in this particular year under pressure is how do we balance those things out? And my office has taken a lot of preemptive steps going into this fiscal year to make sure that we had reserves to try to address what we thought would be a tuition challenge. So we're in pretty good shape to deal with that. moving forward, as you intimated, obviously hiring and those kinds of things, there's lots of little dials that we can use moving forward to make sure that expenditures are controlled as we make strategic investments to improve the university.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Patrick, good job. Thanks for all your leadership. I think we're going to move now to the COVID review, and you all know what this issue is. We've dealt with it at length. Andre, hello, it's nice to have you back. We're required by the state, we as a board, to have a quarterly review of the status of our COVID actions and events and what we've learned, and to see if we need to make adjustments. We don't have to approve in a formal way these adjustments, but we do need to hear them. So Andre, the floor is yours. Tell us about where we are in COVID.
Well, thanks, Chuck, and thanks, trustees, for inviting us back to give you kind of the quick update. So I'm here with a number of the IMT leadership. So I'm going to give you kind of a quick overview, and then we'll kick it to questions and answers. So as far as kind of updates to the plan, we have submitted to those to you. They have been relatively minor in the sense of, there are elements in the plan that spoke to fall term. Of course, we're now moving into winter term, so we made those updates. Probably one of the more significant questions we've been getting is how our plan relates to the new guidance that the state just operationalized effectively today. And quite frankly, it gels pretty well with what we have, because if you remember our plan, we worked with Lane County in developing a COVID alert system, which actually ties quite nice to now what the state is doing with their risk level system. And so really one change, and this is a change since we submitted the draft updates that we'll be making to the plan, will be that what we had as very, very high will change to extreme, kind of following what the state has done. It's also important to note that those changes, and I think where some confusion comes in, again, are not targeted directly at higher education. So the changes at the state level with the risk indicators are sector specific guidance. We still operate underneath Executive Order 2028 that was issued back in March, and we operate underneath the Oregon Health Authority's standards that were issued on June 12th. Those standards have had minor edits and changes, and as those happen, we update our plan accordingly. We also expect that since it's been since June that Oregon Health Authority has looked at the higher education standards, that we expect that in the next several weeks there may be a few more adjustments. And again, we will adopt those adjustments and then keep you apprised of those changes. So kind of reflecting on the fall term and what we set forth in our plan, again, we set a number of objectives in our plan, and our primary objective was reduce the likelihood of COVID illness among our students, faculty, staff, and guests at the University of Oregon. And again, while maintaining, we've talked about this, Patrick mentioned it, while maintaining our core mission. We know that it's disruptive, but that was kind of the challenge we set forth. So we're not just looking at the safety, but how do we actually live with and operate within a COVID environment? And again, there are kind of core elements that we looked at, elements around increasing the testing capabilities, contact tracing, isolation, quarantine, but also something that was an amazing feat to pull off, but basically reconfiguring the whole campus, both the physical space, the operations, instruction, research, to meet and exceed the CDC and OHA guidelines, in addition to kind of timely notifications for our campus community on effectively what those changes are. So kind of a few quick numbers and reflection now that we're through a fall term. We've completed over 16,000 asymptomatic tests of our resident hall students. And when you look at the amalgam of that data, we are at a positivity rate of 0.25. Each week we look at that data, we have never gone over 1%, which is significant. When we looked at semester schools, they exceeded 3, 5%, and then kind of came down. So again, our students on campus, and we're starting to see this now with some new studies out of the national academies, that for the most part, students are following the guidance. Again, off campus, we still have challenges and we're working on that. Our isolation space was never stressed. We did peak in the beginning of the term where we had about 26% in our isolation and quarantine space. Right now we're hovering at 4% for isolation, 7% for quarantine. And then you are aware we have been monitoring mask utilization on campus. And again, this is more of like a challenge call. This is a shout out to our Portland campus. They have been hovering at 99% proper utilization of masks. So that's a challenge now for our Eugene campus. We have been hovering at 95. Of course, we'd love to see both at 100%. And again, as Patrick said, we're expanding our testing capability. So even before Thanksgiving break, we administered about 2,600 tests for students living on campus, 1,200 tests for students off campus. And in addition, we've also now started doing testing within the community, and we're able to administer 1,000 tests for community members. Again, these are asymptomatic tests. So the last couple points to note is, again, the data is out there. You can see it on our dashboards. There's been a lot of talk about flattening the curve. In the beginning of the term, we saw an uptick in our cases. Again, it didn't overstress our systems, thankfully, but we flattened the curve. That does not mean that that Lane County data is looking good right now, meaning we still have a demographic challenge within our community of that kind of 18 to 30-year-old range is still a pretty high portion. But what we are seeing on campus, and specifically like our campus proper, we have not seen any spread on our campus. And so a few things moving to winter term. Again, we're going to continue the plan. We're adjusting the plan based upon the lessons learned, both on our campus, but as I've reported before, we are working very closely with not only public health in the state and locally, we're also using our networks nationally with other universities to look at what's working for them. Where can we adapt and improve our plans? So again, we will continue to kind of stay the course and adjust as necessary. And before I move to questions, I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment to thank everyone on the UO incident management team and our students, faculty, and staff. It has been an unprecedented year. I mean, not only COVID upending our lives, but we had historic wildfires. It's actually, for me, I find it sometimes difficult to even just look back at this year because every week has been somewhat insane of the things that we face. But because we continue to work together, because we're facing those challenges face on, I'm very confident that with our shared mission of protecting the campus, protecting our core mission, we'll be able to do this together. That doesn't mean it's not going to be a bumpy road. With that, I'd like to open it up for questions and invite my colleagues that have joined me today to kind of turn on their cameras in case there are any questions I throw your way.
Laura Lee, go ahead.
Thank you, Andre. You continue to just amaze us every time you give us an update. I mean, it's such good work. I've got a question about our testing program, and when we compare our program at the U of O to other institutions of higher education, particularly when you talk about our positivity rate being so low, and which is fantastic. And I'm wondering if it's an apples to apples comparison, or is it an apples to oranges comparison? We test we test people who are asymptomatic. And so part of our low positivity rate could be due in part to who we're testing. We're testing people who don't have symptoms. And actually there's big bold letters that say, if you're experiencing symptoms, if you've been in contact, if you've tested positive in the last whatever number of days, like, you cannot be tested here. This is not the testing, this is not the testing for you, basically. And so I'm just wondering, as we compare ourselves and feel really good about what we're doing, I just wonder if other institutions are taking that same approach, so that when we're comparing positivity rates, we have similar procedures, or are we doing things differently? And how does that affect kind of our overall evaluation of how we fare relative to other institutions?
So I'll give a few thoughts on that and then kick it to Leslie, because again, there's with the team environment, meaning this is a perfect, I'm glad you asked that question, because we get a lot of questions of like, well, we look different than other institutions in the state. It is not apples to apples. That you need to look at, are other campuses doing asymptomatic testing? Are they using a PCR versus an antigen test? So we do benchmark with, OSU up the road. However, they're taking a different methodology, meaning we're doing a lot more testing of our residence hall than they are. They're using a wastewater, and then if they see something, they go in and do more additional testing. The other two benchmarks we've used have been CU Boulder, their campus, a very similar structure to what we're doing. That's the part where we looked at, they saw a spike in positivity all the way up to about 9%, and then it came down to where we're at. Thankfully, we never saw that high spike. But very good question. I'll let Leslie chime in that it is important that you don't compare dashboards without understanding what they're doing test-wise.
Right. I would second what you said, Andre, and then also add that I think the numbers, Andre, that you presented are not just the asymptomatic testing, but the rates also that include folks who would have gone to University Health Services. So they do include, you know, in addition to the routine weekly asymptomatic testing for those in the residence halls, the University Health Services is doing symptomatic testing. And I believe the positivity rates Andre presented include an aggregate of those populations.
Yeah, again, the one not going over 1% is both diagnostic and asymptomatic. When we, you know, kind of parse out just the asymptomatic, it's even lower.
Leslie, did you have more to add to that, or?
No, I guess I would just echo you know, I really think it's phenomenal that our positivity rates are so low, and it does speak very profoundly and positively to our students and their following health practices and keeping safe. And so we'll continue the weekly surveillance for any students that remain on campus throughout the break, and then have a reloading plan in January, similar to what we did with fall, with a test and then a retest within 5 or so days later as students return to campus in early January.
Great. Laura Lee, you have a question?
Yeah, this is just a quick question, but I feel like this message, low positivity rates, really, you know, good success, is sort of in contrast to or contradictory to some of the Lane County metrics that show college age, like that 18 to 30 group, having such high rates. And so I just wonder, there's a lot of discussion, and there's a lot of, you know, the U of O is implicated in the popular press. There's a lot of, you know, social media and other kind of narratives. I don't know if they're true or false narratives, but the data on the 18 to 30-year-olds, at least in Lane County, seems to not necessarily be aligned with the data that's coming out of our testing program. And so I'm just wondering if you could editorialize that or unpack it a little bit more for us so we have better understanding.
So yeah, and I'll let Cassie chime in, who's been working closely with our case management team. Laura Lee, what we are dealing with is a challenge, meaning what's interesting is the data that we present. So when you look at our case data on our website, that is coming from Lane County. So even our testing program, the ordering physician for our students that are residential hall students are coming from our University Health Center, but everything else is through the county. So I think what has happened is, and I've even noticed, and I was on listening to the county board meeting this week, is when they say college age, people immediately go U of O. And that what we're talking about is you've got a demographic challenge that we face. And again, that's both high school age students to other students. Yeah, and Dr. Ludke, I think, tried to do a good job today, or during the board meeting this week, of stating that our numbers, meaning the U of O numbers, have come down significantly. I think people just got it hooked into their claw. That spike we saw early, which again was late September, early October. Since mid-October, we have flattened. And I think what we're dealing with now is just, you know, people have that in their heads. And again, then there's also just this interesting way in which, again, Lane County Public Health and the Public Health Authority presents the data that they have in the way that they present outbreak data. And I know that some of that data that people have focused on is actually dated. So it's kind of, there's things that take some time to kind of catch up. But Cassie, is there anything you want to share? Because again, we are very much aware of this issue and communicating almost daily with Lane County to say, we need your help in describing this, because our case counts are not high, but yet there's a perception that we're the problem.
Yeah, I mean, COVID aside, the U of O is very visible in our community, and our students are very visible, and that has its pros and cons, right? I think when we had that outbreak, or the kind of flash of cases in, third way through the term. It was very visible, right? It was people outside at house parties and things like that. And so that sticks in people's minds. We've had about 640 cases for our campus of our students, and that is about 14% of the overall cases in the county. So these numbers where we're hearing 45%, a third of them, that sort of thing, it is hard to beat that back, I guess, right? We have limited channels. When we get asked, we take the opportunity, but we also have to walk a careful balance of not saying the Lane County data is incorrect, right? We have to be a good partner to them. So we have to use the channels that we have to refute and put out the correct information when we can.
Of the people who have had the COVID students, have there been any serious illnesses among them, or were they more mild?
Well, to be fair, that data is pretty private, so we don't explore that in any.
I don't know, Cassie.
I'm sorry? Did I freeze?
I was going to say, I believe that Deb Beck is on, but yeah, we can't share specific names, but my understanding is that it's been we've been fortunate. And again, it ties with what we know about that age group. And this is another challenge with the testing, meaning our kids are smart. Our students do a lot of thinking, meaning some campuses have had this challenge that students know that if they test, they may get in trouble or they might get quarantined. So they're just kind of weathering through. But Deb, I don't know if you're on, if you want to speak to that as far as if we've seen any significant sickness.
See, somebody else had a question, Elisa or somebody. I saw a hand. I don't. Oh,
one sec. I think Deb was just on mute, but she, per Andre's prompt, was going to chime in on the question you had asked.
Yeah, thanks. We have experienced just mild to moderate symptoms in our age group for those that we've diagnosed and cared for through the University Health Services. So we've done really well. Our students have done very well.
terrific. Okay, Mary, thank you. Mary, you had a comment, I think.
Yes, thank you all so much. Really appreciate this update. My question has to do more with what the plan is for winter term. I know that the students are going to be staying after Thanksgiving. So, and this may be more appropriate for Patrick or Janet, but what is the plan with respect to testing and instruction and so forth when the students start up on winter term?
Yeah, and I'll start with, again, as Leslie mentioned, we will be repeating what we did in fall for a residential population for testing. We're also looking at expanding that out. So again, now that we have a little bit greater capacity, but we still have capacity issues, to expand that off campus so that we can hopefully grab students and they come back into the community and do that kind of loading test. But yeah, I don't know if Janet or Patrick want to speak about, we've made some adjustments in that, specifically in the first week and load in to help with kind of that testing. And again, we're also now waiting and looking to see at some of the state guidelines where they're, currently we're limited to 50 people in classroom space, but with the new orders that might be reduced down to 25. But Janet or Patrick, you want to speak to that?
Well, just in general, I can speak to the broad concern, which is, of course, we also want to be safe as students return, maybe from less safe environments than being at the U of O, given everything that we just heard about our positivity rates. One of our challenges this year is that the term starts immediately after New Year's. That doesn't happen every other year. Sometimes there's a little bit more of a gap. We, I guess many of us bemoan the fact that we're almost always right after New Year's. There's really not an extension there. But this year it's right on the heels of it. And so, our housing group did just amazing heavy lift to move everybody in, but we had a much longer time. So what we've done for the winter is to acknowledge that we can't start before Christmas and move people in, which is essentially the timeline we were on before. And so we are fully remote in classes the first week. That will allow students to come back onto campus and then to self-quarantine within the residence halls as they're being tested. Before we tested before move-in. And so that's a slight change. It's just an acknowledgement of the realities that we have. Then we anticipate through that we will be kind of under our normal operations, but recall that we had already been scheduling in our kind of calm and deliberative way that we have mostly remote classes. There are a large number of classes, almost now creeping up to 25% that have some in-person component. They tend to be small. And Janet, I don't know if you want to comment. We need to go back through in the next dynamic. Is this changing guidelines from the state? In general, it shouldn't affect us very much, but there could be some instances. And again, a lot of our approach from the educational standpoint, say in Portland, where they've essentially been under pseudo lockdown the entire time, is to make facilities, specialized facilities, like in sports product design, available to the students without it being a formal class, but to control densities where maybe only a single student goes into an art studio to use specialized equipments on our campus, for instance. But we're trying to not hinder students' progress through the access to facilities. But most lecture courses are already remote or formally online.
I will add just very quickly that we've gone through and capped all of our in-person classes at 24 to meet the state guidance of 25, allowing the faculty member to be in the room as well, and then are reaching out to each individual instructor in those courses should they need a larger class. We do have ways to model it so that we can alternate in a hybrid way which students come to class, how many are in a room at a given time. So there aren't that many classes that we have to navigate in that way. Most of them are PE classes and military classes that are meeting in person. So other classes are already small enough to meet the state guidance. So our plan going forward for the winter term is to have those courses at no more than 24 or accommodated with a hybrid manner that we can stay with 25 in a given room, because we anticipate moving in and out of the extreme category. But we can't, once we make the change to 24, that's what we're going to be with for the rest of the term. So I think we won't have a significant impact on our students, that it is quite manageable given what we have currently scheduled.
Hey, Connie, did you have a question? Go ahead, Connie.
I did, thank you. This is kind of going off the comment that I heard about students kind of hunkering down because they didn't want to get tagged to quarantine. I can relate. I've been, you know, have a teenager, but it made me think about contact tracing, and I'm wondering, A, how are we doing in terms of just capacity and keeping up? And then 2, when they are reaching out to students, do we have a good cooperation rate? I don't know if that's the right way to say it, when that's happening.
Yeah, I'll let Cassie speak to that again. Our case management and our Corona Core is something we should be very proud of, which again, I think you all are aware, we have students that are doing this work. But yes, there are some challenges. Cassie, you wanna speak to that a little?
Sure. Just like what you might hear in the news, elsewhere, we're experiencing the same thing where we have folks who you know, don't want to pick up the phone. They don't recognize the number. That we actually talked with a bunch of students to try to understand a little bit more their motivations for, or their lack of motivation, I guess, for not picking up the phone, and try to figure out if there are other ways that we could adjust the process a little bit. So things like, you know, offering text follow-up as opposed to calling them every day. That's something that we have in place. In terms of not recognizing a number, we are working with our IT to set up a system so that the number is always looks the same, because our office phones don't text, and so we are looking at a way to set that up so it looks like it's coming from the university when it might be coming from a cell phone if we're texting them, so that they're more responsive. Things like that. They're not any different from other folks out in the community, though. We just see them more, we just see them more close up. So there's not a magic fix to it. And we just try to keep messaging to pick up the phone, take the call. A lot of the benefit that we've heard is that when it's our students, we have a student team, as Andre mentioned, the Corona Corps is made up of students. And when they hear from a peer, they're much more likely to engage. And so we have been using some of our members of the Corona Corps to reach out to their peers in a little bit different way with the FSL community, for example, so they hear it from a peer. And we've used some of our news stories too to try to do that.
And do you have metrics? I mean, are you measuring how well, and then to your point, what tactics are working, and if you're seeing like using peer-to-peer?
I'm not sure. I don't have that level of detail. We can look into it and get that for you.
Thanks.
Lee, you had a question?
Yeah, one last question about testing. I feel like our relationship with Lane County Health Authority is so important. You know, this is a partnership. I've heard it sort of messaged this way from the very beginning in developing the testing strategy. And Andre, you also said that, you know, we get our data from the Lane County Health Authority. So Lane County actually reports on it, and we get the data that our, you know, U of O students for our dashboard, or U of O community, faculty, staff, et cetera. And I'm just wondering if the counties across the state of Oregon act in a similar way. So for example, is Multnomah doing this for Portland State? Is, you know, Lynn or Benton, I guess is Benton County reporting on data for Oregon State University? How I guess how varied is the landscape across the state, if you have that information, and if it's different here, you know, why that might be?
Yeah, and I'm happy to have Leslie chime in too, because I know she's been working both at, you know, with the county folks on testing, but also state. So my initial reaction to that, Lorelei, is that because we've looked at dashboards for each county, they're all different. One of the things that we nationally are suffering through right now is that there's not standardization in how we are doing the testing, and therefore that leads to a lot of confusion. You know, so in talking with my colleagues up at Portland State, you know, one of their challenges, they're you know, a university in Portland. You know, so they don't draw as much kind of attention as, say, the U of O. And so every county, the relationships are different. I feel very fortunate with the relationship that we've built with Lane County. But yeah, it is not, there's not one simple standard that all post-secondary institutions are using this approach on reporting and dashboarding that information. And that is unfortunate. And it's just partly the way that the state is set up with the local authorities versus the state authorities. And Leslie, I don't know if you have anything else to share.
Yeah, I was just going to add that Oregon Health Authority is actually changing their reporting approach. So up till now, they've been reporting the number of people in their numbers, and they're changing it to be the number of tests. So for example, we've tested students in the residence halls, you know, 5-6 times now, but they're in the Oregon Health Authority system, which then filters down to our county. Those students are only being counted once because it's a repeat test on a person. So I also just want to, I do think our Lane County metrics may change, and honestly, it'll be advantageous because our repeat testing numbers are providing more in the denominator, more tests, but lower positives. So we should keep an eye on not only the county, but the state of Oregon metrics. I think are going to change. They're implementing that change this week. And I think will reflect, it'll ultimately have a lower positivity rate for the entire state of Oregon compared to what we have currently.
Okay, any other questions for Andre or any of the team? Andre, thank you again. Great job. Keep after it. Things are good. Okay, thank you. We're going to turn next to the, Jamie, if you're here, I see you, Jamie. Yes, we're going to turn next to the University Finances and Treasury report. There are several pieces of this, but Jamie, go ahead and lead off.
Terrific. I am hopefully going to get a slideshow up. Can you guys see the slides before I start talking?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. As usual, when I'm on presentation mode, I can't see any of you, so I will try to pause periodically for questions, but please feel free to just interrupt me if you do have questions. So as was mentioned, I actually have a number of topics to share with you today. And what I'm going to do is, I know you got the full financial report in the docket. I am going to touch on the highlights, but please, if you have questions, feel free to ask, because I'd be happy to get into any of it. But as you can see, about 5 different topics I'd like to cover today. So I'm going to start with the E&G fund and the quarterly financial update. So this slide that you're looking at, if you recall, is from the September board meeting, where we shared with you that we didn't yet know what enrollment was going to look like for the university. And there were basically 4 different scenarios that we laid out, with the main difference being how many first-year students should we expect, and specifically non-resident students. In this slide deck, you're going to see a number of these slides from the September meeting, because what I wanted to do was update you on where did we actually land versus the scenarios that we laid out. And anytime you see the green highlights, that's my way of trying to indicate the scenario that we came closest to in terms of where we actually landed. So for the E&G fund, we actually came out in between scenarios 2 and 3. We ended up with about, based on our 4th week census counts of students, we ended up with about 3,950 freshmen. So we were right in the middle of those 2 scenarios in terms of our projections, and we came out roughly in the middle in terms of the impact. If you look at the E&G fund overall, there is absolutely no question. I mean, the pandemic is having a very significant impact on both our revenues and our expenses. Our student enrollment, when you look at the total student population, you compare it to last fall, we are down about 3.6% overall. That is largely driven by the drop in first-year undergraduates. So if you remember, we had a very large undergraduate class in the fall of 19, and we were expecting a very large undergraduate class in the fall of 20. We did see a very significant impact in terms of those first-year students, and that really is driving a lot of the student enrollment drop. So we have been fairly steady with our continuing students. It's mainly just that question of new students in the undergraduate realm. The best estimate I can give you is we're down about $17.5 million in terms of what we expected pre-COVID for undergraduate tuition. We are seeing a little bit of an offset in that in graduate tuition. Both based on rate increases and small increases in some of the numbers of students. So that's helping with our overall budget. But I think probably the most important thing to understand about the E&G fund budget is that the reduction that we saw in the number of first-year students is something that is going to affect our finances for the next 4 or 5 years, because as we roll into future years, we're going to continue to be missing those students on the revenue side. This year, we actually are seeing a lot of cost savings because of all the initiatives that we're doing, as well as just the impact of COVID. And so, for example, you know, there's very little, if any, travel at the university. There's very little hosting. There's just significant reductions in certain S&S categories, as well as a lot of the HR actions that we've taken. And so what might seem a little odd at first, but we'll talk through when we get to the longer term projections, is this year, the deficit that we're projecting is between $3 and $4 million. It's not as large as it would otherwise be. And that's because of these one-time savings. But once COVID disappears, I'm fully expecting a lot of those savings will also disappear. And so we're going to have some ongoing budget challenges that we'll need to address. This slide gives you a sense of the different components of the E&G fund. On the revenue side, I'm happy to report that we continue our funding from the state for this fiscal year still is intact. So we're seeing a slight increase from last year. On the tuition and fee side, we are seeing a decrease, and that's directly tied to the loss of students. On the interest and investment and ICC revenue, those are both areas that we do expect to see increases throughout the year. And then the last two items are on the expense side. And I just want to point out here, personnel services is normally a number that every year goes up and up, and that has to do with labor contracts and compensation. It has to do with PERS. It has to do with health benefits. This year, we actually are projecting that it's going to drop slightly, and that is due to a number of factors on the HR side, our hiring freeze, our work share program, some of our HR actions. So we are thinking that's going to actually slightly decline. And then finally, the place we are expecting very large savings is in services and supplies. And again, that's a short-term issue. As soon as COVID disappears, I expect that the impact of that will disappear as well. And then finally, I'm not going to get into much detail here, but you have the traditional breakdown of revenue expense of what we're projecting for the E&G funds. If there aren't questions on the quarterly, I will move on to our treasury reports. I'm going to get in more detail on our quarterly when we get to the long-term projections, but if there aren't questions at this moment, then I'll keep going with the treasury reports.
Jamie, I have a quick question, and unfortunately, I'm gonna have to hop off for another meeting, so I want to grab it now. And it's really less for you and more for Mike and potentially Roger. But are there plans to increase the number of incoming freshmen next year in an effort to try to mitigate the impact, or have we thought about that yet?
So what hopefully you'll see, and if you're not able to be in that part of the meeting, Marcia, I'm happy to talk you through it separately. We are targeting for next year, our targets, we're trying to stick with our original enrollment targets, which had us at a much higher level. It had us at a level that was slightly higher than 2 years ago in terms of entering freshmen. So we are aggressively trying to move forward with that plan. And Roger and his team, they're continuing to very aggressively work on the recruiting front. I don't know if Roger's on, he could give you a quick snapshot of where we are today, but everything I'm hearing is looking very positive. I think the question is really going to be around COVID. And we saw very big impacts, particularly from students who wanted to be on campus and be taking classes on campus. And so both the progression of COVID and the vaccine, as well as our mode of instruction, I think is going to be the largest determining factor of where we land. In terms of students, but absolutely, there are very aggressive plans on the recruiting front.
So Marcia, this is Roger. I just give you a very quick update. As Jamie said, we've been aggressively working in the virtual space throughout the fall and really proud of our team. The Common App just released data that they're down nationally about 6% in students who are applying via the Common App. I'm really proud to tell you that at the first benchmark, it's very early. I want to emphasize that, very early, but we're tracking 16% ahead of last year, which was a record year of applications for us. So while nationally most people are down, we're actually up 16% from a basis that was a record year for us last year. Now, last year's record year, as you just saw, didn't translate based on COVID. So there's a long way to go, but at least we've started very well. So I hope that helps answer your question.
I guess I have a question for Roger. I would assume we're down what 12.5%, whatever, in your freshman this year. I would assume there's a lot of students that didn't come that may have postponed and say we're going to do it next year when we're off COVID. Do you expect to see our incoming class and looking into fall of 2021 really pick up very, very strong?
Yeah, there's two things we're kind of hoping for there, Alan. Your assessment is right. We had a couple hundred students tell us that they were going to be gap year students, which means we're going to wait just 1 year. Typically, and I think Jamie's got a slide coming about this a little bit later, but typically we see about half those students translate. We also had close to 700, I think the number was, students that canceled deposits. So they didn't tell us they were gap year students, but they had come with us all the way until September, and then they canceled deposits. So there is a big population out there that I think is at play. Our goal is to get a large freshman class and then hopefully supplement it with some of the students that elected to sit out 2019.
Yeah,
So
and
yeah,
when
your assessment's right on.
Yeah, and we actually, Alan, when we get to the long-term projections, our ups, when we talked about different scenarios, we had kind of a base case, a downside, and an upside scenario. And our upside scenario is exactly what you're describing, which is, you know, we move out of COVID, the vaccine hopefully is successful, we're able to recruit a large class, and there's a bump potentially from the students who decided to wait a year. So that is incorporated into some of our projections to try to get a sense of what that would mean for us.
Alan, just one, just from my perspective is it all is going to it's all going to depend on where we are and how we open. We were headed towards record year, and then we decided to go remote, and we lost the students, and that could happen again next year if we're not live in person. So that's what's going to be the major determinant. The vaccine will be the biggest indicator of whether we're able to open in the way that we need to open in order to enroll a full class. But in answer to, I think, Marcia's question, we're not throttling Roger. We're not telling him to come in at, if he can get back to where we were supposed to be and he wants to, go higher, all the more power to him.
Okay. Thank
I have
you.
a question for Roger, also, please. Of the 700 canceled deposits, and then also when we're looking at our Common App numbers, do we know how much of that is out of state, in state, or non-resident?
Yeah, we do actually. Thanks for that question. So in state, this is a little bit like counting votes in the spirit of what's been happening this fall, right? So in state, we're down actually. Now it's a small percentage. We're down, I think, 3 or 4%. It's primarily out of Portland East and West. These are recruitment target areas we have. Portland West usually comes late. It will again this year, I suspect. Portland East is a little more concerning, and our team's working on that. So in state, we're down. That 16% that I mentioned, we're up across the board. Gosh, I wish I had the slide up here. In California, across our key markets, we're running in many places 20 to 22% ahead of last year's record number of applications. We're running very strong in Texas, Arizona, the upper Midwest, which for us is Chicago, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, St. Louis. We're running probably, don't quote me on this one, high 20% range ahead of last year, which was a record year. So in most of our out-of-state markets, we're actually looking really good, which is interesting to us. Our research team's digging into it a little bit, not to be throw a little water on this, but the fact that we're so far out of whack compared to, in a positive way, compared to what people are seeing nationally, just we're trying to dig into, is this front loading? People are simply applying earlier because they're in high school and don't have anything to do. I mean, they have things to do, but more opportunity to apply. Or is this true growth? And of course, we would be the same as all the other schools. So it's interesting to us that we're as far ahead up as we are. But it's a good way to start. It's always good to get out of the gate fast.
Thank you.
You bet.
Roger, quick one. Do the ones that the gap years and the 700, do they have to reapply since they were technically qualified and admitted?
Yeah, so the ones that actually, and Jamie's got the number coming a little later in the slide deck, the students that actually applied for a gap year do not need to reapply. We mark their file, they can come right back in. On those students that canceled deposits, which is the 700 plus, any traction that we get from them, I think we're inclined to be very accommodating, is probably the best way to say it. And as long as they have not started school someplace else or have new academic work that we should see, we would try to streamline them back in.
Let me just quickly chime in to say that, remind people, one of our soft spots over the last few years have also been international students. And we don't expect that to rebound at all in the coming year for a wide variety of reasons. But we are, my office is starting to develop plans to think about what recovery in that space looks like in a more intentional way. So I think that there's, but that will be years down the road, most likely when we see that as a return as well.
Patrick, did you see the article in either yesterday's Wall Street Journal or today's about the nationwide reduction in foreign student enrollment?
Yes, Roger quoted that one pretty strongly in a Senate meeting yesterday about this is obviously a national issue. It'll be interesting to see how the national conversation changes. But countries such as China we won't recover in these spaces as a country because of the attitude that we've taken, because those countries have actually invested in their own higher ed. And then, as Roger pointed out, and the article does, countries like Australia have stepped in where the United States has laid down. And I think from a post-World War II point of view, it's really a huge mistake that the country has made, but we obviously have no control of that here at the U of O.
Yeah, it's really an article worth everyone reading. Thank you.
Yep, I think I'm gonna, if it's okay, I'll keep us going because we do have a number of more topics I want to make sure to get in before our time runs out. So moving on to the annual and quarterly Treasury reports, just a couple slides here. You should have gotten in your docket the annual Treasury report with lots of data and comparative data, the quarterly report, as well as an update to the Treasury procedures and all of those changes that are being made, which are smaller changes in general. We did sit down with Ross, chair of the Finance Committee, and talked through all those, just to let you know. This first slide is showing you what's happening with our total cash and investment balances. This does include all funds, including restricted funds, to be clear. But what you're seeing is a pattern that's pretty similar to what we've seen in past years. The one thing that I would highlight is we are taking advantage. There's a federal program where you can delay remitting the payroll taxes. And so we have about $10 million of payroll taxes that we're able to hold for a couple of years under this program, which is advantageous to us. But it is causing our cash balances to be slightly higher than they otherwise would be if we weren't taking part in that program. But otherwise, we are seeing trends that are pretty similar with patterns of prior years. This next slide is just, I think, from the annual report. It's giving you an update on how we did with our investments last year. On the left-hand side, you can see that each of the components of our portfolio did outperform the benchmarks that we had established for them, including the funds at State Treasury, our fixed income portfolio, and then our T3 portfolio that's held and managed by the foundation for us. They all did extremely well last year. We did see our total investment income come down just slightly in 2020, and that had to do with the overall market in terms of conditions. But overall, we've seen improvements in our investment income as we've invested more broadly and worked with the foundation over the last several years. And then finally, I did want to pull out a slide just to graphically kind of show you what's happening with our debt. On the right-hand side, what you have is the timelines for the different debt that we externally owe. So the dark green that's a state note payable is a combination of everything that we owe in debt from funding that we did through the state prior to the governance transition. And then you can see layered onto that the various revenue bonds that we issued through this board, and that we have bullet payments that are coming in long-term time periods, and you can see how those flow out. And then on the left-hand side, what you can see is what are all the entities that are paying debt to the internal bank so that we make sure we have enough money to then pay off all these external loans. And what I'd point out here, which is pretty typical for us, is that most of this external debt is related to auxiliary projects. So we have our student building projects, housing and athletics, which are a very large percentage of that debt. For academic buildings and other things, what we try to do is get state funded debt so that we can get state support for those facilities.
Jamie, I have a question about this chart. I don't know how you can compare, but in general, our composite fee we charge for debt to a unit compared with what we pay for that debt, how would you compare those?
I would say so we have a bank rate of 5.25, which is what we charge all entities in terms of loaning. We are, in recent years, we have been able, our cost of capital has gone down. And so there has been a gap between those figures. So we're basically collecting enough that we can then pay off all these loans, pay for operations. And then we do have a small presidential initiatives fund that anything that's in the gap goes into. Currently, just to be clear, the president has directed me to use that to help pay for the utility bill for campus so that we can keep our costs down on the E&G fund. So it's directly supporting our E&G funds, but there is, I can tell you with confidence that there is enough money coming in from all of the debt paying entities that we can cover these costs and put away appropriate funds to make sure that we're in a position to pay off all these loans when they come due.
And do we have a policy about it? I know we can't always match it up on a project basis or use basis, but do we have a policy at our bank about that spread?
We have a policy that we charge everybody the same amount, and that way we don't, projects are not affected by the timing of when they happen to go to market. We can change that amount over time if we would like to, but we have to think about it very carefully because that rate applies to all of our projects, and many of those projects were funded in prior years with earlier debt issuances that might not have been as competitive as what we're seeing today. So we do have the ability to change it if we want, but our policy is that we have a standard rate that everybody consistently pays across campus, and so changing that rate would be a pretty significant issue for us in terms of inflows.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to do was give you a brief update, and I am going to keep this pretty brief. There are a lot of materials in your docket, but I wanted to give you a brief update on where we are in terms of our auxiliary operations. So in September, we presented you with a range of scenarios for our 5 largest auxiliaries. In terms of the size of loss that they were likely to see this year based on the impact of COVID. That the first column of numbers that's labeled initial scenarios, these are this is the summary of what we presented to you in September. And what I've done is worked with each of our auxiliaries to update these projections so that you have a better sense of what's actually happening today and where we think we're landing. So for example, housing and dining, they had initially been projecting a net loss of 11 to 15 million because they've been able to take more actions and keep expenses down. They now think that the gap is going to be just under $10 million. So that's coming in a little bit lower. Likewise, in the health center, they were projecting a $2.2 million gap. They actually are coming in close to balanced, and that largely has to do with staffing and expenses running lower than their initial projections. On the athletic side, we had a pretty broad range, if you recall, that worked through a number of different scenarios depending on what happened with football. Because of the fact that we were able to run some of the football schedule, the number that they're showing currently for the net loss, which is just around 63 million, is on the lower side of their range, but obviously still a pretty significant number. In the EMU, we were projecting anywhere from 0 to 1.6 million. It does look like they're being successful managing their expenses and reducing those to match their reduced revenue. And so they actually think they'll be run rate even this year if all holds. And then finally, PE and Rec has struggled a little bit more. They have seen not only losses due to student fees, but also they traditionally rely on a number of sources of other revenue like community memberships, locker rentals, and all those things are down very, very significantly. So that gives you a little bit of an update on where we are.
Amy, quick question. Yep. Given so much of winter quarters going to be remote, are we anticipating any drop off in residence hall occupancy going from fall to winter quarter?
You know, that's a great question. I believe when they do their projections, they're always looking at retention rates, and they're not assuming that every student who's here in the fall is going to be here in the future. I don't know if Roger would know if they did differential retention rates given it's COVID this year. Roger, I don't know if you're still on or what you could share on that.
We did, Jamie. So Ross, we tried to calculate what the winter term impact would be. And one of the things I would share with the board is we are marketing and communicating extensively with families about the low positivity rates in the residence halls. We can make a very solid argument backed by empirical data that your student is much better off in a residence hall being tested every week than in the outside community as it relates to COVID. So we're trying to lean into sort of a safety approach, which is real. And we're hoping that we're not going to see as big a drop off. We did calculate additional percentage points compared to what we would normally see in a regular year. So, you know, we asked all students before they left on break if they planned on coming back. If the survey data holds and they do what they said, we'll be in pretty decent shape. But we did calculate a small drift downward through winter term and spring.
Okay, thanks.
So in the packet that you have, and I'm just going to go through one example, what I did, like I did with the E&G fund, is I pulled the previous scenarios from September. So this is housing and dining. And I tried to highlight for you in green the scenario that closest resembles where we are landing today. And each auxiliary has 2 pages. One page is simply this highlight. So for housing, we were closest to the 35% reduction. And then what I've done is work with each auxiliary to add a specific page that gives you more details of the current projections. So in this case with housing, it actually was a 38% decline that we saw. And you can see the current projected revenue and expense, net loss, and then just some notes about what the assumptions are. So in the interest of time, particularly because I want to make sure we have enough time on the long-term projections, I am not going to go through all these detailed pages, but they're in your document for the health center, for athletics, for the EMU, PE and rec, so that you can see kind of where we landed. And I certainly, you know, if people have more questions, I'd be happy to take them either now or later. But I'm not going to go through all that detail just to keep us on track. So
anybody have an urgent question? I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Chuck.
Does anybody have an urgent question up to this point before the authorization discussion? Okay, Jamie, you're good.
Okay. So the next topic is the expenditure authorization. And as I'm sure you all remember, in the June board meeting, because of the great uncertainty we were facing, rather than try to set a specific number, the board put in place a continuing resolution that simply kept our authorization at the same level of operating expenditure budget as last year. Then we also talked about how each quarter we would provide you with several different things, updates on where expenditures were, updates on what's going on with state appropriation and tuition, talking about the steps we're taking to reduce expenditures, and then whether we have any recommendation about an adjustment to the current continuing resolution. When you look at quarterly expenditures, if you were to take that continuing resolution of 1.1 billion and simply split it 25% by quarter, that would equal about 283 million per quarter in terms of the resolution, just to get a kind of run rate feel. We actually went back and looked at the run rate for how we spend that money over the annual year. And the reality is that first quarter, which includes a good chunk of summer, we typically do not spend as much of our total authorization. We usually only spend about 21.2% on average, looking at fiscal years 15 to 19. So if you were to use that as a proxy on an authorization of 1.13 billion, you would expect that 21.2% would be about 240 million if it were consistent with spending patterns of previous years. Just to update you, where we are today is our actual Q1 expenditures were significantly lower than that. We were at about 217. This is a breakdown of the different areas of where that is. And so you can see that we're running well below that authorization. Normally each year the authorizations go up 3, 4, 5% to represent inflation and our continuing cost base going up. But even with this continuing resolution, we still are well under that authorization. Now I want to caveat that with this is Q1, and Q1 for us, we don't have a lot of data because a lot of our faculty are on 9-month contracts that don't really start till the middle of September. So we will be in a better position, I think, once we get through Q2 to have a more holistic look at this. Okay, so in terms of the relevant information, Chuck, are you trying to ask a question? I couldn't tell.
Yeah, let me try again. I'm sorry. I can't operate the mute button very effectively. Can you index or calibrate that difference? Say the 240 to 217.
Yeah, so right now,
full-time student, faculty, employed, something. I mean, can you tell us how that changed with any of those kinds of variables? How much of it is attributable to that?
yeah, I would say based on what I'm seeing on the E&G fund, that a large portion of this is attributable to S&S reductions related to COVID-19. So normally we have, we spend in the E&G fund alone, I think it's about $7.5 million a year on travel. Well, that's not happening right now because people are not traveling. We also saw a pretty complete shutdown of our study abroad programs, and that's a program that tends to be heavily focused in the summer. And so normally we're spending millions of dollars to pass through tuition revenue to partners to pay for those study abroad programs. That didn't happen. So I would say a very large portion of this, I think, is you're going to find on the S&S side, particularly in the E&G fund, that's related to the impact of COVID and the impact it's having on our operations at the moment.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep. In terms of the relevant information we need to report to you, as I've said before, we're in a pretty steady state with state appropriation. I don't have any updates to give you since September. Again, good news on this front. This fiscal year, we are not, our operating funds are intact. I will preview that when we get to the long-term projections, the current GRB, Governor's Recommended Budget, would represent a cut for the university next year. So I'll talk more in detail when we get there. But this year, our numbers for state appropriation look steady. We've already been through enrollment and tuition. We continue to take a lot of steps to try to reduce expenditures, and that's why you've seen those numbers coming down, as well as just the impact of COVID on our activity levels. And the bottom line for this one is that at this point in time, with just Q1 data, we are not recommending a change in the expenditure authorization. We'd like to obviously come back to you in the next meeting when we have the data through December to see where we are landing, but we feel that we are not going to need certainly to go above where we were last year. And we seem to have a reasonable margin in place right now in terms of the spending level. So I am going to turn, if it's okay, to the long-term financials, which I'm going to need to bring you to a different, unless there are any questions on the things I've shared. This is going to take me just a minute to get this up. All right. I'll just ask once because to make sure before I start talking, can you see this document on the sorry, Chuck, I can see you. I can't hear you. It looks like Chuck's trying to tell me yes.
Yes.
But, okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you, Jill. Okay. So the last topic in this segment that I wanted to discuss with you is we have updated our long-term projections for the E&G fund. And this was actually a pretty rigorous process because with the implementation of guaranteed tuition, we had to restructure the entire model to be based on guaranteed tuition and cohorts of students coming in with guaranteed tuition rates. What we've done is similar to what we've done in the past, where we're trying to provide you with a range of scenarios so that you have an understanding of what we might see happen in the coming years. And I would say that we have more uncertainty at this point in time than we have ever had when looking at these scenarios. So just in terms of context, the packet that you have has 3 different sets of scenarios. And the reason why we do that is because we don't know for sure, we don't know at all actually, exactly what tuition rates are going to be. And so each packet has different assumptions about how much we will change the tuition rate for the incoming cohort of students, because do recall the only tuition rate we're changing at this point is the incoming students. And so we have different assumptions in each packet about what those rate increases will be. And that way you can look at not only a base case and an upside and a downside, you can see it with varying assumptions about how much we're raising tuition. In the first set that we'll look at, the assumption is each year that for non-resident students, that tuition rate is 3% higher. And for resident students, it is 4.5% higher before it's locked for 5 years. We do provide estimates that are 3% for each group and 2.5 for non-residents and 4.5 for residents. So hopefully you get a feel for what's going on there. And then each set of scenarios, we have a base case, a downside case, and an upside case. And the base case, the two major parameters that are changing in each of these cases is what's going on with fall enrollment next fall and what's going on with state appropriation. And for our base case, we do have the assumption that we've returned to our pre-COVID targets on fall enrollment, and I'll show you what that looks like. We also, on our base case, are assuming that we're going to get a cut in state appropriation next year. And the governor just came out on Monday or Tuesday with her recommended budget, the GRB. And just to let, and this is for next year. So this is for the biennium that's coming starting July 1 of next year. And basically the governor's recommended budget essentially sets the Public University Support Fund, or the PUSF, at what's called LAB, legislatively approved budget from last biennium. So it basically keeps the biennial budget even. Now, this gets a little bit confusing. When they give us the biennial money, the 2-year money, they don't give us half the first year and half the second year. They give us 49% the first year and 51% the second year. And what that means is that if your biennial budget stays steady, you actually see a cut because you end up going from the year, which is this year, where we got 51% of the funding, to the first year of the biennium, you're back down to 49% of the cut funding. So I'm happy to share that in more detail if it doesn't make sense with folks, but the bottom line is if the governor's GRB goes through, then the legislatively approved budget for the U of O represents about a $3 million cut for next year. In our downside case that I'm going to walk you through, we actually assumed that COVID is still with us next fall. And we basically assumed that we see fall enrollment next fall that is similar to this fall. So we basically then would have 2 classes of lower numbers of students, which you're going to see really affects our finances. And we also assume that the state situation gets a little bit worse and that the cut is not $3 million, it's $5 million per year. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, we did have an upside case. And the upside case, going back to the question I got about deferred students, the upside case basically assumes that not only do we return to our pre-COVID targets, but we're actually able to enroll those extra students who formally went through the whole process to request deferral. So there's about 150, I think, more students than normal who requested deferral. And then for state appropriation, we assume that we continue with our normal gradual increase instead of getting a cut. So that gives you a sense of the range of what we looked at. And then for each scenario, we're giving you 3 numbers. We're giving you the annual E&G fund run rate, so you can see our recovering expenses. We're giving you a number to understand what would our fund balance be, and then how many weeks of operating expense would we be able to cover with that fund balance. So there's kind of 3 key metrics for each of these things. And then the final thing I want to be really clear about before we dive into the numbers is we assumed in these scenarios, we did not add in additional cost-cutting measures. We did not assume we triggered the progressive pay reduction plan. We did not assume that we're getting lots of savings from early retirement. We did not assume that we're going to go through budget cuts because we wanted to show you how big of a challenge will we be facing before we start implementing all that stuff. Obviously, we're going to have to balance our budget over time. We need expenses and revenue to match, so we cannot proceed forward if there's a gap there. But we wanted to give you a sense of what is the size of the gap that we're facing, and then we will have to take action to fix it, to be clear. So if you look in your pack, what you're looking at here is the first set of scenarios, set A, and in each set of scenarios, it tells you on this first line what the assumption is for the new cohort of undergraduate students, what price will be locked in for them for 5 years. And then a thing that's important to know is that the difference between these scenarios is really what are we assuming for fall of next fall, for next fiscal year and next fall. Once we get, this is fiscal 21 is this year. So you can see in our base case here, we're projecting a deficit of 3.4 million. That's what I just walked you through on the E&G fund projections. Our fund balance will be about $51 million in the E&G fund, which represents 4.9 weeks of operating expenses. In between these scenarios, we're changing the assumptions for fiscal year 22 about state appropriation and about entering students. After that, however, for fiscal years 23 to 25, we are assuming we go back to hitting our enrollment targets, and I'll show you what those are, and that we have slow, steady growth in state appropriation. So that is built into the out years of these projections. I am also including, I want to be clear, a very large PERS increase in fiscal year 24. Now, I may be being too conservative here. It's possible that that will not happen, but I am concerned that PERS may continue to find itself in a situation where it needs to increase rates, particularly because we are not facing a big PERS increase in 22. Because of the timing of when they looked at their asset values and their liabilities, we actually are not seeing a huge increase in 22, but I am concerned that we might see one in 24. The other thing to note on this is we did assume that future compensation costs are in line with our pre-COVID historical experience. And as I mentioned, we have not have not implemented cost cutting into this assumptions about further budget cuts. So if you look at the base case here.
Amy, could I just ask you one question?
Yeah.
Because I was go back up to your assumptions.
Uh-huh.
You have hit enrollment targets for FY 2023. What are your enrollment assumptions for FY 22?
Yeah, so 22 in the base case is that we hit enrollment targets.
Right.
And I'll show you the details of that.
Okay.
That's on my next page.
Okay, I think you said something that caused some confusion.
I'm sorry. Okay.
We are going to hit our enrollment targets in this table.
Yeah, so this base case has us hitting enrollment targets in 22 on, basically, for the base case. Right. Okay.
And I think the just one comment, what this is assuming also is, and you said this in different ways, is that the S&S savings pop back to normal.
Yes. Yeah, you are like 2 steps ahead of me, Mike.
Pardon me?
You are like exactly 2 sentences ahead of me, so you know this stuff well.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's helpful. So as the president was saying, when you look at this number for fiscal year 21 is really only so low, actually, such a small deficit because we have such significant COVID savings. For fiscal year 22, we are assuming that we're hitting our enrollment targets, so we're bringing larger numbers of students. But the challenge is I am also assuming that the one-time, faculty and staff are going to start traveling. People are going to start hosting events on campus. We're going to have more activity. And so I'm not assuming that those one-time S&S savings related to COVID are going to continue. And so what ends up happening is you see in fiscal year 22, it's the impact of having lost the students in 21 that's continuing to affect our budget in 22, 23, 24, and it's finally out in 25 that it starts to get positive because we get past a big chunk of that. But each year, and I'm going to show you the details on this case, each year we're continuing in the base case to add students. It's just that we're working from a point of deficit because we do have a problem, which is that we have a deficit that's caused in large part by the gap of students from 21. So if we go, it might be easier to read. If we go to the this page, what I've tried to do is provide you with an example of the more detailed numbers. So this is giving you all the detailed numbers for this base case. And I'm actually going to jump to the students since we've been talking about it. Anything in blue is an input, it's an assumption. And then the yellow components of this page, which are down below, are the outputs. And basically talking about the students, this first set of numbers was our original enrollment targets that we talked with you about years and years ago with our growth initiative, where we invested a lot of resources in enrollment and recruiting in the hopes of really recruiting much larger classes. What I've provided for you then down here is the actual numbers, what actually happened in fiscal year 20 and 21. And you can see that in fiscal year 20, we had a huge year. I mean, we were able to pull in very large numbers of students. Now, I'm going to have to caveat here. These numbers are actually come directly out of our AR, our accounts receivable system. So it's a slightly different count than the student head counts, but it ties in terms of the direction that the student head counts are going. And so basically we came in with over 4,700 new students in fiscal year 20. Our target was 4,450. We had a similar target for 21. And I think Roger would tell you that we were on track to have an incredible year pre-COVID, but that's when we saw a very, very significant drop in terms of the number of first-year students. And now what we're predicting, or what this current scenario is projecting, is that we get back on track with where we were, and we have some adjusted targets for what we hope to hit. And so the idea is that these numbers are at 4,800, 4,807. Now 4,807 might sound huge. It does if you're looking at 4,059 the prior year. But keep in mind, 2 years ago, we were at 4,755. So it's really a question of, do you think that we will actually get back to our pre-COVID numbers and the trajectory that we were on? And so this first scenario, this base case says yes. To be clear, the downside case says no. Let's look at the numbers that way. So we've run them different ways, but this kind of gives you a sense of the student counts and kind of what is that, these are our goals going forward. It's going from this fiscal year 20 number, 4,755, jumping back up to something in that range, 4,800, and then continuing to grow. These were the aspirations that we had. Just to cover a couple of the assumptions on the top to make it clear. So this base case, you see that we increased our state funding this year. We were in the second year of the biennium. If the governor's recommended budget, which is for a flat biennial budget, is true, then what we would expect is that we drop back down that next year. So I've put in an estimate of about 3 million, and then it slowly starts to climb up. A couple other assumptions you can see right here. These were our larger tuition increases that we put in place last year in order to implement the 5-year guaranteed tuition program. This scenario then assumes that we are simply increasing that guaranteed rate by 3% for non-residents, 4.5% for residents, and then it's locked for each cohort for 5 years. And then finally, we have the last 2 years decided to not continue with the strategic investment fund process, our strategic bag process, because of the budget impacts of COVID. But we do have small investments that we need to make because we had some Tyson advisors that we needed to set aside some funds to budget them on permanent recurring funds. They had been budgeted on gift funds. And then when you get to the bottom, for each scenario, you can see then that it comes down to a beginning fund balance. What I've showed is the net run rate, and then the ending fund balance. And then I've given you a number to show you how much our operating expenses are projected to be per week, and then the number of weeks of operating expenses that we have. So this is more of the detail. And there is also a slide in here that shows you the actual detailed projected revenue and expense. So you can see that. Sorry, I skipped over one thing, and I apologize for going back and forth, but I do want to make it clear that in order to hit these enrollment numbers, we have dedicated significant larger numbers to scholarships, to fee remissions for students. And we absolutely have to do that to be competitive. And so what you're seeing over time is that our discount rate, when we use just our general fund remissions, not our foundation scholarships, is growing. And that is necessary to be able to be competitive. Otherwise, what we found is it's unrealistic to have targets of this magnitude if you're not including significant fee remission support in order to recruit those students.
And Jamie, are our international student numbers still viable, or should we be being conservative on those?
Yeah, I will tell you, and I probably should have made this change. At this point, when I talk to Roger and he looks at these numbers for next year, it's not so much that we absolutely need, this 180. It's that we need 2,500 non-residents. And so I think in the short term, Roger's really thinking about this, and I don't mean to speak for you, Roger, but we're targeting this many non-resident students. over time, as the provost mentioned, we'd love to see international recruiting increase, and we'd love the diversity they bring to our campus. And so I'm sure we're going to be focusing more on that. But for the time being, I would think of this as kind of an interchangeable, where these are the number of non-residents that we're trying to target.
Jamie, for those, this is Laura Lee, for those discount rates, I see them going up. Is that an aggregate of discount rates that would be given for both resident and non-resident, or are you really just focusing on the non-resident discount?
That is an aggregate. That is an aggregate rate. We actually give much higher percentages because of the pathway program to residents at this point.
Gotcha.
Because the pathway program is such a I mean, we have a huge number of people that are getting full tuition and fees. Yeah. So then just to round out, and then I'm happy to take questions, going back to set A of scenarios, what we just walked through in detail is this first base case. So what happens if we hit our targets, we get, the governor's recommended budget comes through, which is a budget cut for us of about, 3 million, somewhere just under 3 million. What happens? Well, what happens is next year, we actually, if we don't take other actions, we actually run a pretty significant deficit. And again, that's because we're still feeling the impact of the loss of students this year, but we're assuming that COVID activity has, we don't see those savings. And then over time, that loss would get smaller. It jumps up in 24 because of the PERS increase. And then finally, when you're 4 years out, you finally have the impact of growing classes. But when you look at it, I mean, from a fund balance perspective, we'd be dropping to a very, less than three weeks of operating expense, and our fund balance is extremely low. So you can see the challenge there if we're not taking some type of budget action. Again, this assumes no budget actions. The downside case is brutal. If you assume, to be very clear about what I assumed in the downside case assumes that next fall looks like this fall. So we don't have 4,800 students. We have, 3,950. When you combine 2 years of lower students, it's a huge impact. We're probably looking at deficits in the $20 to $25 million range. So that's a really challenging scenario for us. I did assume, just to be clear, that if the world looks this bad from an enrollment standpoint, we're still struggling with COVID. And so I did include about a half a year of COVID savings in 22. So assuming that we still aren't spending quite as much money. But even with that, we're still looking at, a $26 million gap. So very substantial challenges. If next fall looks like this fall, we would have to take very significant, I think, budget actions in order to rectify this, because we could not function. This obviously shows us going into negative fund balance in the E&G fund. But then you have a positive scenario at the bottom, which is to answer a question that was asked earlier, what happens if enrollment goes back to normal and we see a slight bump because we have students who didn't come this term? And so this scenario includes about 150 extra deferral students. Plus, it assumes that some federal funding comes in and the state ends up budgeting us, a slight increase in the PUSF instead of a cut. And you can see in that scenario, we would still likely have a small deficit next year, but very quickly we'd then be turning to more positive numbers and starting to grow back our fund balance. So I guess I know I've shared a bunch of weeds with you, bunch of details. If there's anything I'd hope you take away from it, it's that we're at a period of unbelievable uncertainty. And what happens next fall, whether we are able to open in a way that we're in person and lots of students want to come and we see enrollment go back up versus we see a repeat of this fall in terms of our enrollment numbers, it will have a dramatic impact on where we land. And hopefully that's what comes through with this modeling. And then just before I wrap up, the pages behind this are the exact same set of assumptions, except the only thing that's changing is you'll see different assumptions about the incoming cohort tuition rate. So set B has it at 3% for both residents and non-residents, and it runs through those exact same analyses. And then set C has it at 2.5 for non-resident and 4.5 for resident. So it just gives you a flavor of kind of how those things vary.
Okay, are there questions for Jamie?
I have a quick question. This is Mary. when you talk about the savings, if COVID goes away and we now then will have the travel costs and so forth, the S&S savings, is that a net in that there are obviously significant costs with respect to, because we have COVID, we have the testing, we have, just so many significant costs because of COVID. So when you're talking about how costs will go up, is that taking into account the net effect of the savings from not having COVID expenditures that we're having now?
Yeah, so right now, all of the extra COVID costs that we're having, we're trying as best as we can to use. We received about $8 million of federal funds. Okay. So we're trying to treat those as one-time costs that we got one-time federal fund money for in the modeling. And then when I talk about the COVID savings costs, on the S&S side, it is a lot of stuff that I think is just business as usual for a normal university. I mean, people are doing research. They need to travel to their research sites. Faculty need to travel to conferences and to meet with other faculty. I think that is all going to pop up. I think the challenge that we're going to have is, like, right now, for example, we're in a hiring freeze. We're trying very hard to keep a lot of positions vacant. We may get to the point next summer that we have to do a budget cut and remove some of those positions permanently. Now, that's going to put struggle, because right now a lot of people are working extra to cover things that, vacant positions used to do. So we have some challenging questions ahead of us. But when I say the costs are going to come back up, mainly in that vein, I'm thinking about the S&S costs that just really are, right now we have very few hosting costs on campus because no one's hosting any events, any conferences, any lectures, any, all that stuff is not happening. And so that will come back. I can only see Mary, so I don't know if other folks have questions, but
just a comment. I mean, continuous good work by you and your team. Appreciate it. Not easy times. Personally, I'm more optimistic that we'll do better than the base case, but we got a plan for all sides of this. So good work.
Yep. Thanks.
Jamie, I have a question. This is Laura Lee. I think it's very helpful to see kind of these different scenarios, and to try to make sense of something that is perhaps so unpredictable and anxiety provoking in terms of, where we'll be in the world with COVID, where families and students will be in terms of their interest in the U of O and their comfort level of coming here, committing to come, to actually coming, to staying, graduating, and all of those things. We may not necessarily know where we land for quite some time. And I guess my question is, and it's really helpful to see these case scenarios, but at what point do you and other, administrative leadership talk about cost containment or reductions? Like at what point do we talk about that once we know which case we're in? Do we talk about it in advance of what case we're in? Messaging that is really important. And I feel like, as a member of the campus community, our Achilles heel sometimes is the communications piece about this. And so I'm just wondering, it's really nice to see these cases in the absence of any reductions, just so we have a better sense of where we're at. But at what point do we kind of add more layered conversations about reducing costs and so on, or containing costs?
And I actually have I don't mean to be complicated, but I'm going to give you a 3-part answer to that, because in my mind, there really are 3 parts. So part number 1 is we are trying to keep expenditures low right now. So we right now still have a hiring freeze in place where no one can hire without it going through an approval process and exceptions process. We have a pay action freeze in place. We have a travel freeze in place. We've been putting the word out to people to only spend S&S on essential items. Like, the reason our expenditures are so low right now is because we are trying really hard to get campus to reduce expenditures, given that we have so much uncertainty. So the idea, like with the hiring freeze, is keep every position vacant we can, because if we need a budget cut, it's always much easier to cut a vacant position than to have to cut a position that has somebody in it. So I'd say number one, we're trying very hard, and that's why you see the total expenditures down so much, I think, compared to the level of authority. We're really trying to reduce expenditures down. Point number two is something Patrick said that you guys aren't going to be in the weeds in, but it is going to affect campus, which is right now the E&G fund is close to balanced, but what's happening is centrally we're feeling the loss of the $17.5 million of undergraduate tuition, and the savings are actually out in all the departments and the schools and colleges and the administrative departments, because that's where the budget is and where people aren't spending money. So Patrick alluded to this, but we are going through a process where we are going to be on a one-time basis kind of rebalancing budgets a little bit just to manage that issue of where the savings is and where the lost revenue is. And that's something we've been working with the provost's office on, and we'll be talking about with the vice presidents and others, but it's more of a one-time issue of making sure the savings are aligning with the lost revenue. And then to really answer your question, I think the permanent question of what you do is one that we need to think and plan about, but in my mind at least, I don't think you'd want to execute until you know what our situation is. And so I think of things like the university task force right now that's been set up with Senate leadership and the president and provost to really have a group of people that are trying to collect information from campus, to get involved in an engagement process, and really be thinking about, if we get in this situation where we have to cut $25 million, what advice would they have for the president and provost on that? So that team is up and running. I believe they've been reaching out to campus. They're currently in engagement efforts right now to really think about those longer term questions. But I don't think we're going to be in a position where we have the information we need until next summer, really, about what's happening with the state budget and what's happening with enrollment.
And Laura Lee, if I could just say, my own take on this, and Jamie doesn't just operate off by herself. The base case is our best guesstimate about what's going to happen. I mean, there's varying levels of optimism and pessimism, but what this is saying is we're going to have to do something next year to somehow reduce our costs. But what we don't want to do, I think, is today do something and have to do it again. It's just like, you're just the morale issues, the level of, particularly right now when people are working so hard. So we'd like to see what the magnitude is. Are we in a $25 million problem, or are we in a $13 million problem? And then we'll take actions. And as you know, we have the progressive, whatever we call pay reduction. So we have about $10 million there that we could implement for 1 year. So we have things in our tool bag to do. It feels premature right now. It even feels a little premature to be messaging about it, because what we're asking people to do is reach back. I mean, the thing we haven't talked about today is, and we know this, and I hear it, faculty are exhausted, administrators are exhausted, students are sometimes in trouble, and many students are not adapting particularly well to a remote environment. So this isn't really the time to be doing that when we really don't know what we need to do. But we're on it, and we're doing contingency plans. So we'll be in a position once we hear what happened with state funding, and once we sort of see the early returns on enrollment, and once we see what the vaccine, how fast it is. I'm incredibly optimistic that the vaccine will be out there in the spring. That we're obviously hearing on the news. That changes next year entirely. It still means we're going to have a $13 million deficit in all likelihood, but it takes away some of those awful cases.
Any other questions for anybody at the moment? Or Jamie, any final comment before we turn to audit?
No, I think that's good. I guess again, the biggest thing I would convey is just that there really is a ton of uncertainty rolling into next summer. So
Yeah. I think we need to take like a 5-minute break, okay, and then rejoin. So please kind of hold it to 5 minutes. And all right, Angela, you're okay?
Yep. Charlie, are you there?
Okay, good. Hi, Scott. Haven't seen you before today. So we're ready for the audit report section, and I guess, Jamie, you're going to lead this off, right?
actually, Kelly is, I will chime in periodically, but Kelly Wolf is going to lead us off with just a couple of key slides from the audited financial statement report.
Okay, Kelly, welcome.
Good morning. Thank you. Can you see this slideshow?
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you. So thank you for welcoming me this morning. So this is the FY20 audited financial statements. The main slide deck is in your packet. I'm just going to hit a few slides, as Jamie said. This is for the audited statements as of June 30, 2020. So right at the front end of kind of the COVID impacts. So not a full hit from that. I'll start with the executive summary quick. Not to steal Scott's thunder here, but the audit did come through with no findings or comments. So a clean audit from our perspective. We're very good with that. We had one comparing year over year, one large kind of non-standard transaction this year, and that related to the gift of Hayward Field. And I will reference that a few times on the impact on the financial statements of that particular gift. Our overall revenues went up roughly 24.9%, and primarily that was due to capital grants and gifts. If we take Hayward Field out of that particular calculation, overall revenue was up about 0.6%, so relatively flat year over year. Overall, our expenses, when we exclude the adjustments for the pension and OPEB liabilities mandated by GASB, the overall expenses went up 2.1%. Our net position, so the bottom line, increased overall 32.5%, and that's primarily due to investment in capital assets. Some major projects came online, obviously, again, Hayward, Bean Hall, Tykeson Hall, and the Health and Counseling Center all came online during this fiscal year. So that increased our capital asset, which increased the overall net position. Looking at the unrestricted net assets, that dropped by 4.9 million if we exclude the GASB adjustments.
Yeah, and one thing I just want to emphasize for folks, because we're so used to talking about E&G fund numbers. When we look at our audited financial statements, that's looking at the entire university. And so the numbers that Kelly is sharing is for the entire university. It includes auxiliary operations, it includes grants and contracts and everything. So if you're thinking this doesn't look exactly like what the numbers you're used to, it's because we're looking through a different lens at the overall operations.
Thank you. Moving forward, a couple of slides to our sources of revenue. Hopefully, yeah. You can see this is the year over year breakdown by category of our revenue increases. This large kind of gray block at the top, this is again capital grants and gifts with a major impact of 181.8%, mostly Hayward. We also saw a reduction in auxiliary revenues. Obviously, this is a COVID impact. So housing, athletics, PE and rec, EMU, and so on. So our revenues went down at about 8.2%, and that's roughly 17.1 million year over year. Questions? Okay, I will continue to move forward. These are the expenses, and this is again by program. So if you look at our financial statements, the statement of revenues, expenses, it's presented programmatically, instruction, research, public service, and so on. The major reduction, obviously, we see here is auxiliary programs. So kind of an offset of the revenue reductions that we saw on the previous page. That's roughly $13.3 million of reduction, which was 6.4%. And we also saw an increase in student aid of 19%, and that's tied somewhat to the student crisis funds and the CARES money.
What is the explanation for the radical change in research, the 6.9 to whatever that other number is? Is this a classification issue or a?
It's because a lot of the research stopped for the last 3 months of the fiscal year. So we weren't able to draw down federal research monies. This is the expense page. You would also see a somewhat corresponding reduction over on the revenue page because these are reimbursable grants. If we don't do the expenses, we don't draw down revenue. So with research expenses kind of stopping, that's the reduction you're seeing.
So we were pretty much, I mean, we were in almost a total shutdown in the end of March, April, May, June. And that's, I think, the impact you're seeing.
Yep.
And I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said about the explanation on the student aid difference.
Yeah, so we put, we were issued student monies, grant monies for out of our Students in Crisis Fund to help support the students. And we were able to draw down some student CARES monies as well.
Got it. Thank you. Sorry.
No problem. Any other questions on expenses? I'll go again to the net position by category. And this does exclude our liabilities related to GASB 68 and 75, the pension and the post-employment benefits. You can see the bulk of our net position is tied up in capital grants or capital assets. Major increase over the year of 44.1%. It's about $388 million. And up at the top, this is the unrestricted net assets, shrunk just a little bit, as I mentioned before, about 4.9 million or 3.7%. This is before the GASB adjustment, so this is somewhat corollary to our operational impacts. If we look at the GASB impacts, we do have, for those, just as a reminder, roughly $264 million in liabilities sitting on our balance sheet or statement of net position related to the GASB 68 and 75 pension and post-employment benefit liabilities. So that drops both our restricted for gifts, grants, and contracts, which is this gray box here, and drops our unrestricted net assets from positive to negative. So questions on that? It's the same impact we see, have been seeing over the past number of years, whereas our unrestricted net assets drop to negative. Okay, the last item I'm going to touch on briefly, and I will tell you that the ratios that we typically present are in your packet, and you're able to go see those yourself. I won't bring them up. I will tell you they are somewhat unusual this year, and that does tie to the Hayward gift. In that, I'll try to simplify. When Hayward was being built, it was classified over on the foundation financials as a temporarily restricted net assets, which brought up the ratios. Once it got gifted to the university, it came out of their temporarily restricted net assets into our capital assets, so it does not feed the ratios on our side. So our ratios will look artificially, will show an artificially low drop this year from year over year because of that gift, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'll just remind people that, if I might, the ratios that Kelly includes in the back, they're industry standard. They're called composite financial index ratios. They're industry standard ratios that the HEC actually asks us to report on. I don't love these ratios because they basically pull a bunch of foundation assets that are restricted and reflect them as if they're kind of not restricted in my mind, because they're supposed to tell you how your resources compare to your debt and your resources compare to your expenses. And I've always felt that they're a little misrepresentative when they're pulling foundation restricted assets. This is just a given year where you can see that there's something crazy going on because a bunch of the assets that were tied to Hayward were in the ratios the last couple of years and just got pulled out. So it just looks like we took this nosedive, but that's actually not anything operational. It's just the way the ratios are calculated.
Yeah, they were not built for this particular type of transaction.
Yeah.
Kelly, just to confirm, the Hayward gift is based on an appraised value as opposed to a cost?
That's correct. Yeah, we were not provided the actual cost of that gift. So we contracted with a construction estimator who went through and gave us a dollar value that answers the question, what would this have cost if we had built it ourselves? And that's what we book into our books as the value or the cost of that particular asset.
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions? Happy to field.
Anything else, Kelly?
Nothing from me unless there's any other questions.
Any other questions for Kelly, or I guess we can throw Jamie out there too. All right, Scott Simpson, our external auditor. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. And all right, can you guys see the first slide there?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to go through the 2020 audit results, and we have some required communication to those charged with governance. I'll start off with auditors' opinions and reports, talk a little bit about that. We'll go through, like I said, the communications that I'm required to have to those charged with governance, the board. And then I have some other information, I have actually several slides of just general comments that I'd like to make for the group today. So with that, as Kelly did mention, we did issue an unmodified opinion on the financial statements, which means that the financial statements are presented fairly in all material respects. It was a good, clean audit once again this year. I was impressed, thrilled, and just so pleased at how well the finance team, the accounting team at the university, as well as our audit team were able to navigate doing this audit essentially remotely. There was lots of time spent in Zoom calls, Microsoft Team meetings, sharing screens. It was actually a very successful audit, and I couldn't be more pleased with how things went. And the results are outstanding. Once again, a clean audit for this year. So we do issue a report on those financial statements. And again, that was an unmodified opinion. We do typically issue several other reports. The first one is Generally Accepted Government Auditing Standards, a report on internal control over financial reporting and on compliance and other matters. In this report, if we have any internal control findings, we do have to call those out in this report, as well as if we noted any instances of non-compliance or any other matters. This report is bound in the back of your financial statements, and it says that there were no reported findings in either the internal control side or compliance. So good, clean report there. The last piece that we do, and I typically report to you guys on it at this meeting, is our report on the compliance with federal awards. And this year is a little bit different. We have two programs that we looked at this year. The first was student financial aid, and the second is the higher education emergency relief funds. We've not issued this report on compliance as of yet, because we are waiting for the OMB to issue guidance on the higher education emergency relief funds. At this point in time, they have not released that audit guidance. So every other large university across the country is in the same boat you guys are at. So we're waiting to get that guidance. We're hoping that it is issued any day now, and we will be able to complete that portion of the audit. Like I said just a moment ago, we did look at student financial aid cluster this year and audit compliance in that cluster. We did not have any findings, no issues to report in that area. And I do have some additional comments that I'd like to make to you guys on just kind of what we saw a little bit later on in this presentation. So more to come on the compliance audit that we do. I want to reiterate the communication of internal control related matters. We break those down into two areas, what we call material weaknesses. That would be an internal control related matter that could have a material impact on the financial statements, if not corrected. And then the second is a significant deficiency, which is less in scope than what a material weakness would be, but still a significant item that we would need to report to the board. For both of those areas, we did not have any internal control related findings that would land in either of those buckets. And actually, we did not have any situations where we had any internal control related exceptions, large or small. So it was nice, clean. The system of internal controls at the university is operating effectively and appropriately designed from what we saw. With that, I'm going to move on to our required communications to the governing body. Our responsibility is to conduct the audit, which we were able to do. It's management's responsibility to design and implement a system of internal controls, to prepare the financial statements, and to provide us with that copy of those prepared financial statements for us to audit. We were able to carry out our responsibilities, and management was able to carry out their responsibilities without any issues. The planned scope and timing of the audit went according to what we set forth at the beginning of the year, and we issued our audit report on October 30th this year. I believe in the last, in the prior year, it was October 31st, so it's really kind of the last Friday in October that we issue, and there were no problems getting that completed on that date. In the financial statements, I believe, which are in your packet, the significant accounting policies are disclosed in footnote 1. And there are some significant financial statement disclosures that I listed out here, footnote 5, 9, 12, and 13. I just called them out because they are pretty significant. Footnote 5 is your capital assets. Footnote 9 is your long-term debt. And 12 and 13 are pension-related footnotes, pension and OPEB. We did not discover, or we did not have any significant difficulties during the audit. There were no disagreements with management. If during the audit we identified accounting adjustments that needed to be made, and we proposed those to management, that would be a corrected misstatement. Or if we proposed it and they decided not to make it, that would be an uncorrected misstatement. There were none of those, and we have not had any of those either corrected or uncorrected misstatements since our time with the university. At the end of the audit, we do obtain a pretty lengthy representation letter from management with all the representations that they make to us during the audit. That was obtained without any problems. And then the last couple items here, to our knowledge, management did not consult with any other accountants. There were no internal control matters or other significant findings that we need to tell you about, and we did not identify any fraud during the audit process. So all in all, the communications to the board are all very positive, and there were no issues that we feel like we need to report to you at this time. So just some other information here. Questions are welcome at any time from any of the board members. And to make sure everybody knows, I do have periodic communication with the chair of the board as well as other board members throughout the year. The president and I touch base during the audit, and if there are any significant issues that were to arise, I, as your external auditor, would not have a problem getting in touch with the chair of the board, the chair of the finance committee, and the president. So if something came up, I would be in very quick communication with them. Communication with the university remains really strong throughout the year, and I attribute the success of these audits in large part to that. The university has a strong team, but one of the things that makes our audits very successful is we're talking throughout the year. We're identifying accounting transactions. We're talking about things that happen during the year. So when the time comes to audit, we've already addressed those items. We already know what direction the university is headed, and it's kind of old news to some degree. So that really makes a big impact on how the audit is done. And finally, the staff were so well prepared for the audit this year, as in prior years. And it's important for you to know that we are given complete, unrestricted access to any documentation we want to see and to any of the university personnel that we request to talk to. A few items of special recognition. Student financial aid. I have used, I think, this term with the board in the past, but your student financial aid department is what I will call best in class. I've done audits of colleges and universities for 20 plus years now. I've audited literally over 100 different universities, and the student financial aid department that you have is best in class. They do an outstanding job. Our audit is so clean, so thorough. The team knows what they're doing, and it's a real pleasure for us to do that. Every year I'm doing probably 10 plus higher education audits, and I would say every year in half of those, there are findings in student financial aid. But the University of Oregon Student Financial Aid Department, Jim Brooks, wow. So I wanted to make a special recognition to the board of that because I think it is important that you know. The second item, internal audit, obviously a change in directors of internal audit this past year. And Leah Ladley has, in my view, been outstanding. I will tell the board, I meet with Leah every single month. We have a standing phone call. We talk about internal audit. We talk about my external audit that we're doing. We brainstorm with one another. We run ideas by one another. And I could not be more impressed, and what a pleasure it has been to work with Leah this past year. So again, wanted to make sure that I passed along that recognition to the board. And then finally, the finance business affairs office headed by Jamie and Kelly, the team that they have built, I am impressed by every year. It is a pleasure to work with them. professionals at every level, and it makes the audits go by so smoothly. And so a huge warm thanks to them and the work that they do diligently day in and day out. There's enough challenges right now in the world, in the university community, and not having to worry about the team that you have should be of great comfort in that area. And just to show some, here are some of the people that we really want to thank. I've already mentioned many of them, but they contribute to having a great and a successful audit. And so with that, if I can figure out how to stop sharing my screen, I am open to questions.
Thank you, Scott. And boy, thanks to all of the people, Jamie, in your shop there. That's high praise. That's great stuff. Any questions for Scott?
I just have a quick one. Scott, I'm curious, we had a finding a couple years ago, and I just wanted to check in and see how we're doing on that particular area. And then I would just I would echo what Chuck said to our team. I sit in on a lot of these audit calls for various things that I'm involved with, and I have never heard an auditor say the kinds of things that Scott said about our team today. So just kudos to the UO team and all the work and that led us to this point.
I second that. I've been in on some calls that were quite different than that in the past, not at Oregon, but in some businesses. Anything else for Scott?
Well, so I wanted to address Marcia's question real quick. She asked a follow-up on, there was a finding several years ago that had to do with research and development. That was not last year, but the year before. We did have a finding there. Because we had that finding, we re-audited the research and development cluster last year, fiscal 19. And we did not have that same finding. And what I had to report to the board last year was what I felt was huge progress by the entire research team in bringing in some new people with great skill sets, to supporting a number of people within the university to get research designations. I felt like they had made great strides last year. And so, but I did not look at research this year. So we rotate off, but last year it was a positive report last year.
Great, thank you.
Anything else for Scott? Okay, Scott, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And thanks for noting the people that have really done great jobs. Okay, Leah Ladley, our new chief auditor. And Leah, this has to be a unique thing for you. You've been an employee, but have never come to the shop or something, whatever that story is. But at any rate, as you can tell, you're off to a wonderful start. And we all very much appreciate it. So, Leah, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for those kind words. And I thank Scott for his words too. It must be an auditor thing, because when I think about the conversation that he had, I could mirror what he said about the communication. So between Jamie and Kelly and Scott and myself, there's active communication all throughout the year. We have standing meetings, and we have open and honest conversation about planning audit coverage, so that we don't duplicate, but yet we cover the gaps, make sure that we're looking at things. I would say that each of these people are very self-confident, and that they would come to you if they felt something was amiss, and they would have that conversation. So I think that's very important for you to know that. Angela, did you want me to briefly or Chuck, did you want me to briefly walk through the audit report, or do you need to move on? I know time is tight.
Why don't you walk through at least briefly for us?
Okay, well, I'll give you 4 highlights. How about that? 4 little highlights. At the beginning of the packet, you see that a couple of your auditors are contributing to the Corona Corps because the university is feeling some stresses and needed a little assistance. So we're contributing a few hours a week to that. And the team is very excited about being able to help out during this pandemic. The second thing I would tell you is that we are currently developing a 6-month audit forecast for you. We did not develop an audit plan, as you recall. I had just gotten here and worked a few days on campus, and we all went remotely and tried to deal with a pandemic. So in order to keep things progressing, we're going to try to develop a 6-month forecast for the next upcoming 6 months. So I think that'll make everybody feel like we're a little more comfortable back where we normally live. So this will be a mix probably of assessments and audits, because sometimes we don't really know what's going on in an area, and an assessment fits better than an audit, just so we can see what kind of risk is in the area and what kind of controls are there. So we may do a mixture there. Assessments can also lead to control improvements though. So don't let that make you think we're taking it easy. We're not. The third thing I would tell you is that open recommendations are moving along, and I don't have any concerns in that area. We're making good progress there. And the fourth thing I would tell you is that for the audit progress, we've got a couple of exit meetings scheduled before the end of the calendar year. And so we're moving along there. And there have been no high priority observations made by internal audit for the university. And so things are looking really good. Do you have any questions for me?
Any questions? Leah, welcome and thank you very much.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We'll see you regularly. Okay, I think we're going to turn to our last subject, which is a tuition setting preview. And we have Kevin Marbury who's one of the co-chairs, and Jamie, who's the other co-chair of the TFAB. So I don't know who wants to lead off here, but we're ready.
Great. I am going to kick us off, and hopefully you guys can see the slides I just put up here. Kevin and I are going to give you a quick update on what's been going on. We have 3 topics we wanted to briefly touch on today. Just a reminder about where we are with guaranteed tuition and how that affects our process this year. Second is a quick update on the work that TFAB's been doing this fall. And then finally, I do have updated projected cost drivers for you for next year. That's a critical thing that goes into our analysis when we look at rates. So just to start us off, and we did talk about this a little bit earlier in the meeting, so I'll make it quick. I do want to remind folks that we have transitioned to the new guaranteed tuition program. And what that means is that for the students who start this fall, and that's our first year students and our transfer students, their undergraduate tuition rates are locked through the spring of 2025. And so that means that that includes their resident or non-resident tuition rates per credit hour. That includes all of their administratively controlled mandatory fees. So that's all your health center and tech fee and building fee, their summer tuition rates, any differential tuition related to the honors college or the business school, as well as the international student fee. So all those things are completely locked and will not change for those students through spring term of 2025. And then just to remind folks, because we're in a transition period, what the board took action on last year was a little different program for our continuing undergraduate students. So those students who are already here, we didn't want to raise their rates as high as the incoming cohort because they're not going to benefit from 5 years of a rate lock since they're already in progress with their degrees. And so instead, what the board approved for those students is basically incremental 3% tuition and mandatory fee rates for the next several years. And so that was all discussed and approved in the board meeting last year. And the reason why I raised that is just it's important to realize that TFAB's role with undergraduate tuition is very different for the coming year, because really what TFAB is going to be focused on is what is the rate that we set for the next year's cohort of students that will then be locked for them for 5 years. And so I just wanted to be clear that when TFAB comes forward with recommendations for the undergraduate students, it is a more narrow scope given our guaranteed tuition program. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Kevin, who's going to talk a little bit about TFAB. And Kevin, just tell me what to do and I'll keep the slides going for you.
Thank you, Jamie. And I'm going to relish telling you what to do. I never get that opportunity.
There you go.
So good afternoon, trustees. We'll just start off by saying that it's good to see your faces, even if in a virtual setting. And with no disrespect to my usual cohort of characters, it's nice to see different faces in this Hollywood Squares piece that we find ourselves in every day. Most of you are familiar with this presentation, so I'll get through it as quickly as I can. But TFAB is an advisory group to the president, and so we don't make decisions, we make recommendations. And our two primary responsibilities are to develop the undergraduate tuition rate or a recommendation for the undergraduate tuition rate for this incoming class in the fall of 2021 or fiscal year 2022 in fiscal terms. And then we're also going to review proposals for all of the mandatory course fees and the graduate tuition proposals, as well as housing and course fees for this upcoming year going forward. It consists of 19 members, 5 of which are students. I think you heard from Isaiah earlier today that he is one of the 2 students representing ASUO. There's also a graduate student, and then two kind of wildcard students that are on the board, on that board. 2 faculty, one of which comes from the Senate Budget Committee, and then the rest of the committee is made up of a really diverse, robust group of individuals from across the campus, different levels of positions and titles and things of that nature, but a good group that I think really represents the needs and interests of this group, as well as the needs and interests of students who are going to be impacted by the recommendations that we make. This year, because we're in the pandemic, meetings are still open to public, but as in past years where people could just kind of walk into the room and be a part of it, we are doing things virtually, and in an effort to kind of protect the integrity of the meeting in terms of not having people Zoom bomb, whatever, we've asked folks to register to receive meeting access. And we have a great person who monitors the waiting room when we start our meetings, so that if an individual has registered, we admit folks in that we know are coming to the meetings. We have had on average, about 3 guests per meeting so far, and really good attendance from our TFAB members. I think I was looking at some preliminary numbers in the mid to high 80s in terms of percentage of attendance at 4 meetings that we've had thus far. You can go ahead and flip, Jamie. The fall term is a term when we do a lot of our foundational work, and a lot of that is based on House Bill 4141. And so we cover historical and comparative data, a lot of budget information, some background information on the Public University Support Fund. But then this year we added a little bit more to that foundational information because of the impact of COVID-19. And so Jamie spent a lot of good quality time talking about how the pandemic has affected what we are doing financially at the institution. The winter term, though, becomes when we do a lot of the real heavy lifting, and I will schedule probably about 8 meetings over the course of January and February, which is intense because we're basically meeting every week. And then during those meetings, we will review the proposals from the various mandatory fee groups, from course fees. We'll talk about graduate programs, and then we'll spend some real quality time establishing the undergraduate tuition rates for the fiscal year 2022 cohort. We will also host a student forum on tuition, and we have generally done that in collaboration with the ASUO. And I think, again, Isaiah made reference to that in his comments this morning. He's eager to help us drive individuals to it. The challenge will be, of course, because we're going to be doing that virtually, how do we create an environment where people can feel good about coming into that kind of a setting, but also being able to, be seen and heard. And so we've had some preliminary discussions on maybe using breakout rooms for some of the smaller group discussions, and those rooms will be managed and hosted by the members of the TFAB going forward. We will then, after that forum, after some deliberations, make a recommendation to the president on what we think the recommendations or those fee rates should be. He then will make his recommendation based on ours. He will then post that for community comments and feedback, and he will host a forum on tuition as well that we will coordinate with him to make sure that happens and people are able to get in and have a chance to comment. And then he'll finalize his recommendation that he presents to this board in the March board meeting. The next couple of slides are basically another way that we are trying to be as transparent and inclusive of individuals who want to be involved with or aware of the TFAB process. We have a really robust website that has been updated like every week after meetings, with minutes, with the schedules, with all kinds of information in terms of how we run through the process. A lot of the documentation and charts and graphs that we are using to prepare ourselves to make a recommendation are also included on that website. So if you're not coming to the meetings, you can still kind of follow along, even if you are unable to actually attend the meetings. But it's a really good process, I think, and a good way for us to make sure that the information is available to people when they need it or whenever they need it. It's also a great way for us to help our TFAB members be better prepared to participate in the process, because they get a chance to look at information prior to the meeting and come in with not starting from square one in some cases. So that's the structure of TFAB has not changed significantly from past years. I think the big thing is us trying to work in the virtual piece of it and making sure that people still feel like they can be engaged, even though they can't necessarily sit in a room with us and look us in the eye when they have a question or whatever. I will say one other thing, that I think that the students this year have been really engaged and present in our meetings, and that's always encouraging, because when we make our recommendation to the president, we will include a minority report if there are individuals who have concerns about the recommendation that we're putting forward. And so a lot of times that minority report will come from students or even other members of the group, if they're not feeling like their voice is truly being heard through the course of the meeting. So it's encouraging to see a very active and engaged group of individuals working at TFAB this year.
So the final thing we wanted to do is just give you a set of the updated cost drivers for next year. And just to remind folks, these do not represent every single cost that's going to go up at the university, but what they try to capture are the large known costs that go up every year, and try to put some numbers around that so that we have a sense of what we are looking at. If you look at this number, if you remember numbers from prior years, which I'll show you, we actually are looking at the lowest projected cost increases that we've seen, at least in the time I've been here. And they're divided up into our typical categories that you see each year. There really are three reasons why these numbers are significantly lower than prior years. The first is that if you look at the compensation increase, the cost increase for faculty, staff, GE salaries, and OPE, this year we are not, because of the COVID pandemic and our budget issues, we are not implementing our normal annual salary increases in January for faculty and for our officers of administration. We have been on a cycle of doing small annual increases, but this year we did work with the faculty union to come to agreement that that's not something we're doing this year, given the pandemic and the budget issues. So that is saving us some funds. The second reason why these numbers are lower than normal, if you look on the strategic investment line, we do normally go through a strategic or critical investment process where we allocate about $2 million per year. We did just outright cancel that process this year, given our budget challenges. The one number that's still in here represents some funding that we had pre-committed from that pot because we needed to support some of the student advisors that had been previously funded off of some gift funds. And then the final reason why this number is lower than you might expect is that we are not seeing a large increase in the PERS costs this year for the E&G fund. And so that cost driver is not on there. And so the total is about 10.6 million, which if you look at that in terms of a percentage basis, is actually just under 2% for the entire size of the entire E&G fund, which again is, I think, the lowest numbers we've ever had. Just to finally give you a sense of scale, these are the numbers that we projected the last several years at this point in the process. And you can see how much lower we are sitting this year. Now, it's still a cost increase from where we are this year, but it is much significantly lower than prior years. And again, mainly you can see in fiscal year 20, we had the large PERS cost increase coming in at 7 million. Thank goodness we don't have that expense this year coming up. And then you can also get a flavor for how much lower our projected compensation cost increases are due to skipping that annual increase that we normally do in January. As well as right here's the lower strategic investment fund. So this is one of the things on TFAB, one of the things we did in our final meeting, we actually created a brand new, what we call tuition calculator, which is a tool that the TFAB uses to kind of look at what's going on with the E&G fund budget. What do we think might happen to state appropriation, might happen with enrollment. These cost drivers are part of that calculus that go into the calculator so that we can run lots of different scenarios with the group and just have people, brainstorm different scenarios. What does that look like for our finances? What does that look like in terms of tuition rate increases, et cetera? So again, just we're pretty early in the process, but we wanted to give you a picture of things are moving forward. They're progressing, as Kevin said. We can't meet in person, but we are meeting regularly through Zoom the way we normally would in person, and we're continuing with our normal process going forward. So we'll be spending lots of time together as a committee in January and early February, and hopefully, that will result in good recommendations that will go to the president. So gives you a little bit of an update.
Jamie, question. Given the adoption of a guaranteed tuition program, has that in any way changed the tone or the focus on the early TFAB discussions?
It's going to be really interesting to see if it changes anything in January. The early discussions tend to be, we do so much training. Like we spend hours and hours trying to get everybody educated on the budget and how that works and, historical comparative information and all those things. And so those meetings are typically about learning and getting people up to speed. And so I haven't noticed a significant change. I think what'll be interesting is whether the discussions feel different in January and early February when it really gets into the questions about what's happening with tuition. I think it's a little early to tell. So.
And since we made that decision, has the competitive landscape across our peer group changed at all with respect to guaranteed tuition? That may be a Roger question. So.
Yeah, I don't know if Roger's still on. The only thing I can share with you is I believe, and this is I'm pretty sure, I always get nervous saying anything in a board meeting when I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that the one thing that might have changed is that at the point in time that we implemented guaranteed tuition, the UC system, I think, was really strongly looking at it. But I think COVID stopped them. I don't think they ended up implementing. If Roger's on the phone, he would know for sure. But that's the one piece I'm aware of that's changed in terms of the competitive landscape and the progress that other schools are making on this topic. I don't know if anyone, that's all that I've heard of. I think Roger might not be with us anymore. So that's something we could follow up on.
He is not with us, but we can pose that question to him.
Yeah. And Ross, to your first question, one of the concerns I had was that there was going to be some pushback because students felt like they were not going to have the voice since they weren't doing all of the things that we do in guaranteed tuition in the past, but they still have that voice. They're still setting the tuition rates for the incoming class or whatever, as well as fees and going forward. So I think that concern is gone. I don't necessarily think that that's going to be an issue when we get into the conversations in the winter term.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
A couple of questions. One is, normally our costs don't go up a lot year over year, but because this year our costs are going down in a lot of areas, and I didn't see that accounted for in our cost drivers. So I'm just wondering how you'll think through that and tell that, and then tell that story. And then I wonder, and my guess is it's probably too early because I haven't thought about this any significant way for my org, but do you have any sense of what the overall, like, will there be an overall like COVID increase that has to be put in place from a health and safety perspective as we look, as we look forward? And that may be way too early to think about that, but I'd just be curious, like have more wash stations or more janitorial for the next 3 years as a result of this.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a first shot on those. So in terms of the costs, the cost drivers are meant to capture kind of the recurring increases in your normal recurring base and what's happening. You are absolutely right in that between this fiscal year and next fiscal year, we will see a big jump in costs, because what we'll see is the cost drivers, and then we'll also see that the COVID reductions will probably go away as people travel and host and all that stuff. Where we've incorporated that in for consideration is the calculator that we've developed has a spot where we have estimated what those one-time cost savings are, and we're explicitly assuming they're going away next year. So they're included in the overall calculations. Obviously, there's a little bit of guesswork and exactly how much are we down and exactly how much will we pop up, but we've set it up in a way that we can change those assumptions on the fly with the committee. And that we can look at what those numbers then show. So we are capturing that issue because it's a very significant issue. I mean, we're looking at very significant swings in our S&S budget in particular. And then to the second point that you raised about costs going up, I will tell you from the initial analysis that we've looked at, which we will share with the board in March, our tuition rates on both the resident and non-resident side are really right at market, if not slightly above, now that we have the guarantee. So we're, giving out a 5-year lock. I think we're going to have to be very thoughtful and careful about how we think about tuition relative to demand in other schools in terms of pricing. And so my guess is that we obviously feel a lot of budget pressure, but I think we're going to have to look very carefully both at the market and kind of what's going on, as well as what students can really afford given all the pressures that are on their budgets at this point. So I think it's going to be an interesting discussion this year, and there's going to be a lot of parameters going into it.
And then, Mike, I think it would be interesting for you and Patrick at some point, like, is there a way that we can continue having students in a remote way down the line? I'm not expecting you to answer it now, but just, knowing that we need to increase our revenue base and hopefully not increasing the corresponding cost base, and so we can get back in the, break even-ish range. So I think that would be, I would be interested in that discussion at some point down the line of like, how do we do that in a responsible way?
Can I respond to that very quickly?
Yes.
No, I think, Marcia, as always, you're thinking ahead. I will say that we're kind of coming out of our response mode. Part of our response coming in, especially out of the spring to the fall, and Janet Woodruff Borden has led this effort, is to invest in faculty to do more formal course design of online courses. So we've actually built a set of assets that we will continue to expand. What we don't have, and I think what you're getting towards, is an actual institutional strategy around this. And we're actually just starting meetings on Friday with Roger and Janet and others to start thinking about what would our strategy be in this space. It's a crowded field, and historically the U of O's position has been to kind of do some online to make some courses available to students. We don't have a consistent strategy. There's a couple of ways that we could move forward, and we'll start exploring those. OSU a long time ago decided, and to their credit, that they were going to own this space almost in the Pacific Northwest to some degree, and they've done a great job of that. So it's a crowded field for us to all of a sudden say that we're going to be a major online campus. That's not our intent. I think our value is always going to be a residential campus. But that doesn't mean that we can't really view this as especially as a way of providing access and potentially affordability, especially within the state of Oregon. I think that there's a lot of changes in higher education in Oregon that are going to come with demographic changes. I don't think the state is really planning for that. I think the U of O should be part of all of that work.
Thanks. I look forward to hearing more.
I think Chuck has had to step away. So are there any other questions for Jamie or Kevin? I don't see any. Thank you, both of you. This is always an interesting time, and I think it's even more interesting with the guaranteed tuition. So it'll be fascinating to watch how that unrolls, and the different questions that come up from the students. Restricted, unrestricted is the usual question and confusion, but in this case, that whole issue of, well, we're setting it for the next group. They always were, but it felt different. So I think that it'll be an interesting process. So I see nothing else for the two of you. We will now adjourn the meeting till 8:30 tomorrow morning. So same time, same station. And we'll have our commercial from Oxidol or something now. Anyway, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow morning.